Oh, g'day, mate. 40 here. So a lot of Republicans are talking about this as the last possible election that Republicans were going to have an opportunity to win. Sometimes they say this because the Democrat cheating machine is just running so rampant. There's just so much voter fraud, and now Democrats will have a whole stranglehold on American politics, and no Republican will ever again have the opportunity to become president of the United States. I do not believe this. The main reason for this argument is changing demographics in the United States. So whites are now down to about 60% of the American population, down from 80% in 1980, down from nearly 90% in 1960. And so whites primarily vote for the Republican Party, non-whites primarily vote for the Democratic Party. So it's this perception over demographics that's behind the doom and gloom. For many Republicans, they fear that there's no chance the Republicans will ever get to win the presidency again. Francis Wilkinson wrote July 15th, 2020 for Bloomberg. As Ronald Brownstein points out in a essay on Trump's neo-Nixonian 2020 campaign, Americans today are far more racially diverse, less Christian, better educated, more urbanized, and less likely to be married. In polls, they are more tolerant of interracial and same-sex relationships, more likely to acknowledge the existence of racial discrimination, and less concerned about crime. What Ronald Brownstein describes is an American enlightenment that viscerally rejects Republican resentment and chauvinism. The GOP embrace of Trump has further narrowed the party's already restricted access to the growing segments of the American electorate. It is deeply unpopular among voters under 40 who will determine the future of the U.S. In propping up Trump's corrupt administration, the GOP has grown increasingly authoritarian. Really? So what rights have people lost in 2020 that they had in 2016? Now, it seems obvious to me that in 2020, the most authoritarian moves were made by all sorts of Democratic governors and mayors who decreed that all sorts of rights that Americans had taken for granted, such as the right to go to church, meaning the right to practice their religion, the right to peaceably assemble, had been taken away. Essentially, much of the country under Democratic administration has been placed under lockdown. That's the most authoritarian development that I can think of in American political life in a century. Please tell me where I'm wrong. Having repeatedly failed to take an exit ramp from white nationalism. Did you know that the Republican Party was all about white nationalism? The Republican Party finds an exit from democracy itself beckons as the only sure means to stave off further electoral decline. The next 4 months may be a very dangerous patch off-road. Wow. So Thomas Edsall, a favorite liberal opinion columnist, writes a weekly column in the New York Times. His article today is What is Trump Playing At? And he interviewed about 30 or so historians and constitutional scholars, tried to figure out what was going on in here, because we are in unprecedented territory. We've never before had a losing candidate, refuse to accept the validity of the election, with the exception of Al Gore in 2000, who wanted to recount in Florida. But Donald Trump is alleging, and he pretty much has the Republican Party behind him, that there's widespread corruption in multiple states and multiple jurisdictions. And this is unprecedented. So Thomas Edsall interviewed these historians and constitutional scholars trying to figure out what is Donald Trump's endgame here. And Sean Wilentz, a professor of history at Princeton, said it would not be simply a major departure, but a deeply dangerous one, were Trump to deny the legitimacy of Joe Biden's election. It would be a brutal renunciation of American democracy. It would create not simply a fissure, but a chasm in the nation's politics and government, telling his tens of millions of supporters, as well as his congressional backers, to reject Biden's presidency. It would be an act of disloyalty unsurpassed in American history, except by the Southern secession in 1860-61, the ultimate example of Americans refusing to respect the outcome of a presidential election. Trump would be trying to establish a center of power distinct from and antagonistic to the legitimately elected national government, not formally a separate government like the Confederacy, but a virtual one, operating not just out in the country, but inside the government, above all in Congress. I think that's right. Trump may well be trying to establish a center of power distinct from national government presided over presumably by Joe Biden, a virtual government, a counter government administered by tweets, propped up by Fox News, whatever alternative outlet Trump might construct for himself, kind of Trumpian government in exile, run from Mar-a-Lago, or maybe from wherever else Trump selects to reside in to avoid prosecution by the state of New York. John Wilentz and others argue that Trump is gearing up to violate a principle of peaceful transition established shortly after the founding of the nation. Trump's refusal to concede and the support he is getting from his fellow Republicans part and parcel by the right, especially since Barack Obama won a majority in 2008, to constrain and limit political participation by minorities by every available means, gerrymandering, voter suppression, restricting the time and place of balloting, setting new rules for voter identification, and so forth. On this theory, allowing the November 3rd vote to stand would, in the face of rising minority participation, endanger the ability of the Republican Party to compete in future national elections. And let's get a little something here from Joseph Cotto.
Biden is a perfect vessel of this goal. So that's my take there, Blog of the West. Sorry, Paul, anything to say about Blog of the West brought up?
Yeah, it seems to me that the animus directed against Trump seems, to be a combination of two things. One, that he is often rude, speaks incoherently, fights with Hollywood actors, with everybody else, and usually does not sound very coherent when he speaks. He therefore plays into the hands of the media, which, I think probably 60 or 70 would be their collective IQ. Most of those people strike me as absolutely dumb, but they keep with the same message, like Jim Acosta or any of these those horrible ladies.
And it's not true that the national media are dumb. They are high IQ, according to surveys. So you even have one Nobel Prize-winning economist who's a leading pundit, and that's Paul Krugman at the New York Times. So I think you'd find that the average IQ for reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal would be around 130, which would probably be above that of the average college professor.
Can't even think Joy Behar or something. Right, they're just totally stupid. But they keep after it. They keep attacking Trump. And even somebody who's a critic of his, Mark Tyson, had a piece in the Washington Post a few days ago saying that for conservatives, he's probably the best president of their lifetime. He's done more. And he's been the most effective president in terms of the economy of any president in the 20th or 21st. I can't think of anybody that certainly Franklin Roosevelt did not. People were dealing with a horrible depression beside a proliferating managerial state under him. But Trump really turned the economy, built the economy, kept the country at peace. There's nothing in which he failed as a leader. And I would have to say, at my advanced age, that possibly with the exception of Eisenhower, he was the best president of my lifetime. Obama was an absolutely horrible president who was simply enjoying. He also didn't strike me as particularly bright. He always reminded me of a law professor that he might have had. He just doesn't sound as intelligent, Obama. It just never struck me. But Trump was an extremely competent president. They got rid of him for this senile fool and this extreme LGBT activist who have taken over. We're going to wreck the economy probably within a year or 2 years. They're going to lose badly, I think, in the midterms, if the midterms are fair. And if they do not succeed in bringing enough illegals in and giving them citizenship and voting rights, they can do that. So that would affect the 2022 election, right? But the fact that this idiot won and beat a highly competent president is extremely depressing. I'll just throw that out there. Right. Yeah, no, it's and usually presidents who have records like Trump get reelected easily. Now, I don't think the fact that he was not, at least at this moment, was not reelected, has anything to do with his programs, or even how he handled the COVID, which I think was highly competent compared to most other leaders dealing with the same epidemic. The death toll in proportion to our population was lower than in many European countries like France, Italy, other places, some of which have had much more severe lockdowns, and their economies are wrecked. Unlike our economy, Trump handled all this stuff very well. He did not deserve to lose. But I think the media destroyed this man, and they will do this to anyone they don't like. And it's not just the American media, it's all their lackeys in Europe and in Canada and elsewhere who will join and say the same thing, because they really have the same social background and the same views. And they'll also lie. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. If it were possible to make the media disappear, evaporate into air, we would have a much better chance of surviving as a constitutional republic.
From Luke Abaddon, the DNC will 100%.
Okay, so he referenced there an essay by Mark Thiessen in the Washington Post, and he says Trump essentially is the best conservative president in our lifetime. His victory over Hillary Clinton stopped Democrats from replacing the late Justice Antonin Scalia with a liberal activist, saving the Supreme Court's conservative majority. He appointed 3 fantastic new justices. He's had more than 200 judges confirmed to the lower courts. He signed the first comprehensive tax reform in 3 decades. He removed the wet blanket of Obama-era regulations smothering our economy. He scrapped the Trans-Pacific Partnership that advantaged China and brokered new trade deals with Mexico, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. Before the coronavirus pandemic, unemployment reached record lows. And even in the midst of a pandemic-induced economic crisis, 56% of Americans say they are better off now than they were 4 years ago. Donald Trump made the United States an energy superpower, getting rid of President Barack Obama's Clean Power Plan. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord. He supplanted Russia and Saudi Arabia as the world's largest oil producer, which has transformed the national security landscape in the United States' favor. He drove the Islamic State from its caliphate and killed its leader. Unlike Obama, he twice launched military strikes against Syria for using chemical weapons against civilians. He withdrew from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal. He reimposed crippling sanctions on Iran, forcing the regime to cut funding for its terrorist proxies. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, and he brokered 3 Arab-Israeli peace accords. And he is the first president since Ronald Reagan not to start a new war. Right. Thomas Edsall, his column in the New York Times today, he quotes Samuel Moyn, a Yale historian, discounts fears of a Trump-led insurgency for a different reason, that Trump is not up to playing the role of a strongman. I think we will come to understand him as the weakest recent president, Moyn wrote, and this unprecedented situation in which he refuses to acknowledge election results is just more proof. Moyn rejected the notion that we are in a dangerous situation because instead of a serious threat, we have something more like a parody of a coup. I like that, a parody of a coup, one which, moreover, is something like a conclusive demonstration of the limits of Donald Trump's power all along. That Trump does not care about the scope of the mayhem he creates, that he revels in anarchic conflagration, creates exceptional danger. Philip Bobbitt, professor of law at the University of Texas, is an expert in national security. He raised the question of what is called the continuity of government. If Trump succeeds in preventing acceptance of Biden as president all the way to January 2021, what is known as continuity of government becomes a problem. Continuity of government is an artifact of the nuclear age. What happens to the national command authority vested in the president and to nuclear deterrence if a surprise attack decapitates the U.S. leadership? The problem resurfaced after 9/11 when it became known that the 4th plane seized by al-Qaeda was headed to the Capitol and would have struck during morning business in the House. The result could have rendered Congress helpless until new elections replaced enough House members to reconstitute a quorum. In the interim, martial law would have prevailed. These problems could be lethal in the chaos that Trump is seeding. A number of scenarios could result in the constitutional drop-dead date of January 20th, leaving the country and many elements of government deeply divided as to who the rightful occupant of the presidency is. What happens to the national command authority vested in the president? And the continuity of government vulnerability could spawn a number of emergency powers granted to the president, some highly classified. We could well face the use of these powers by the president based on his professed belief that the election was irredeemably flawed and that a coup against him was underway.
Get away with stealing this. I don't think so, Luke. That's my honest perspective here. I think that a lot of this is going to be uncovered, and I think Trump still probably will wind up winning the election in a very unconventional way. But Paul, anything to say about what Luke brought up?
I think he might be right. I don't, unlike Joseph, I'm not optimistic about this. I don't think it's going to be turned around. I think Biden will become president. At most, they may have.
Okay, let's say hello here to Babylonian Hebrew. Looking good, my friend.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, you were the first person to, you were one of the original people to wear a mask. You were ahead of the curve because of the CPAP mask.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. That was I was leading the way with my CPAP. So Babs is riding the train, everyone. So buy stock at Amtrak. Luke, I think this would be a more compelling live stream if you had more original content and we're not just reading other people's work. Yes, it would be. I need a woman here to do the reading of other people's work. It's a shame I don't have more original ideas. A shame.
Have a recount of some votes in some district or something, but it will not be enough to change the election outcome. And the only good thing that might come is it will cause the Democrats so much grief that they won't try this in Georgia. And I would hope there'd be some way that a Senate would hold back this attempt by executive order to legalize all the illegals and give them voting rights. Because that, and then maybe they'll invite more in because they won't have any borders by then. But I'm very, very gloomy about the outcome of this race. Certainly Trump deserves to win. But whether, and there was fraud committed. I have no doubt there was fraud, massive fraud. But I don't know whether the Democrats will fail to steal. They will steal the election, I'm afraid, at least at the presidential level, I'm afraid.
We'll see what happens, but I think the Republicans have a very strong case, and I look forward to seeing it play out, especially this new judiciary which Trump has structured over the last 4 years. From Luke Abaddon, GOP's overperformance in Congress guarantees President Biden's Night of the Long Knives, metaphorical of course, will now succeed against radical left. Huzzah, will be beautiful. I think that he will try to purge, so to speak, the left, or maybe Harris, she's on the left very clearly, but I think you're talking about the AOC mindset folks, Luke, but they will have quite a bit of power because they are the Democratic Party's future. They are young. They are the grassroots. And if the Democrats try to silence them, I'm sure they will, especially presuming that Biden wins, which is kind of a safe presumption. But in the event that he does win, for the midterms, the Democratic establishment will try to silence this element, but this element will not just shut up. It's going to flip out, even if that causes the Democrats to lose more seats than it otherwise would have. So, I think that's what's going on here. So I think if Biden does win, and he and Kamala Harris think they can just essentially marginalize these people and castigate them and keep them quiet and not have these folks influence the mainstream of the Democratic Party, Biden and Harris will be sorely mistaken. Paul, anything to say about what Luke brought up?
Yeah, I think they're stuck with him. The same way that the Republicans have evangelical Christians voting for them, or gun owners or something like that. But in the case of the Democratic Party, that left is much more powerful than the gun owners or evangelicals because they shape the entire social program on immigration, on LGBT rights, on feminism, on the notion that America is a systemic racist country. You have to sort of deal with this. Biden doesn't like saying that. I mean, when he ran for president, he said it was a systemic racist country. He was like praising America after he won, because he's an older man like me, and he simply remembers when you say nice things about the United States. So he sort of reversed to that. But he really doesn't count. You're not really dealing with him. He's just a front. He's like the president of Germany or Israel or someplace like that. He's just basically a figurehead at this point. I'm struck by the way the manner in which I'm listening to Fox News and someone says, and of course the question is, how will President Biden deal with this? President Biden is not going to deal with anything. He'll deal with about as much as my pet basset hound. It'll be the left that control him, his handlers, all these others, and the cultural Marxist left is the very heart and soul of the Democratic Party right now. That's why Schumer and Pelosi and the others go along with them. And I would think in the House they probably had enough votes there to they were the ones who forced through that ridiculous impeachment of Trump. Remember?
Yep, definitely. I'd just like to raise the jug to Nick, the newest member of the channel. Thank you very much, Nick. Awesome that someone has joined. It's always good to see that. Thank you again. From JB, he says, keep fighting to stop the steal. I presume that's what that's a reference to. Yes, we must continue the efforts to stop the steal, to raise awareness about this horrendous state of affairs. And it's very important that Trump not concede the election. I think, as Van Jones thinks, that if Trump does not concede and he continues with his legal challenges, he can pull this out. I really don't see any two ways about it. I know Trump has the will to keep the pressure on.
And the top of the New York Times right now, they were speculating that Republicans' refusal to concede the election will help them fight those two Senate races in Georgia. It's also a great way to fundraise. Apparently, most of the fundraising, which is ostensibly going to fight the steal, is really going to these political action committees to fight for other Republicans.
Speak. So I'm very optimistic about the future holds here. Paul, anything to say about what JB brought up?
Well, I think Donald Trump Jr. made a statement that was worth quoting, and it was on Twitter. They haven't removed him yet, apparently. And it was something like, my father should declare total war against the enemy. And I thought that was pretty good. I figured like the total war, not harsh, total war. Where enemies are. He's not going to send, unlike the Brett Baer and the others who are urging Trump to send in a gracious concession. This will not come. It will not be a gracious concession. And I think Trump may have learned the truth about Fox News. He was praising them for a while, but I don't think he's going to be praising them anymore, at least not the news commentator section of it.
Certainly not. From Forza, Jersey, Trumpism is more popular than Trump. Let Trump do his best to secure our elections going forward. It wouldn't be close if Trump did a better job. I think Trump did as good of a job as anybody could possibly do for us in Jersey. He was under unimaginable pressure. He had 10 different things coming at him in 10 different minutes, 24 hours a day, essentially. So I think he did a fine job. He wasn't perfect. He's still not perfect as a president. And in his second term, I don't think he'll be perfect either. But he did, for any of us to really criticize the job he did, when he did a great job on the whole, but to criticize him essentially because he wasn't perfect, I don't think that's fair at all. Most people have cracked under pressure on day one of his administration, but he's kept at it for 4 years. That takes Herculean effort. And that's my take here. But Trumpism may well be more popular than Trump. That much I agree with. Paul, anything to say about what Forza Jersey brought up?
Yeah, I think the problem with the way Trump handled the presidency is that he should have stayed with what was his strength. He was an extremely good administrator. He ran the presidency well. He ran the economy. He did all these things well. He overexposed himself. And, instead of fighting with some idiot Jim Acosta or someone on CNN, one of his underlings should have done that. Well, he has these very good people working for him. His press secretary, all these assistants, they're extremely articulate. Let them do the fighting. You don't do it, or Sarah Saunders, these other people. Let them do the fighting. You never open your mouth. You never get into this. When Eisenhower was president, he never got into these imbroglios. He had Dick Nixon do it for him or somebody else, right? So I think he just should have, but it's not his nature. He should have stayed out of it. If you're going to get into a fighting match with these people, sound coherent, have your arguments well developed, give them systematically and so forth. So I think he very definitely failed at the second, which he should not even have undertaken. I think that was a mistake. On the other hand, as a populist leader who appeals to the white working class, he's done extremely well. He has created a large populist movement, which bears some resemblance to the European populism. And, the right in Europe is populist, just as the right is in the United States. So he might have left as his final gift to this country a large populist movement, which he will not lead in the end. Somebody else will have to lead it. It's sort of like the Peronistas in Argentina. Perón may have started this, but somebody else had to take his place after he died. Populist movements just go on and on sometimes. So some of the people I'm sort of like looking at them. Donald Trump's son is both of his sons are extremely articulate. They speak brilliantly. Let them take it over. And I think Donald Trump Jr. already took over part of his work. Or at least joined in his work when he was having those rallies in the last week of the campaign. But you can give it to the give it to a younger generation to do. But I think that populist movement will remain behind because it's the only right that makes any sense right now, right? Because the left is no longer Marxist or communist, whatever they tell you the Republican Party is untrue. The left is cultural and social, and it wants to destroy bourgeois Christian or Judeo-Christian society, whatever, and replace it with a world in which gender pronouns are not permissible, and they run around tearing down statues. It was the same thing in Europe, by the way. So the right combines cultural conservatism with, one might say, welfare state economics or something like that, because the capitalist class is now on the left. It's on the cultural social left. So, that's why Trump populism looks like FDR, FDR welfare statism or something like that. But the entire nature of politics has changed. And, if you want to be on the right, you have to be a populist now. So I think Trump has created that style of politics for the United States. He didn't create it. It was there before. It goes all the way back into the late 19th century. But he has been able to exploit it very effectively and to bring into existence a populist movement that will probably, survive his own passing from the political scene.
It's worth noting that even though Trump is more pro-welfare,
it did not portend a nationwide, bad habit in which one party would assume almost total power and engage in massive fraud everywhere, obvious fraud in some cases, but would have the media covering it up for them. It may have been a small beginning to this, isolated beginning, but you cannot compare this in terms of its scope or gravity to what's happening right now.
From Wojak Woes, are the millions of people who deny the election fraud, are they dumb, delusional, or downright dishonest? In all cases, I sense insincerity from their denial. Some are dumb, others are delusional, but I think more are downright dishonest. Maybe they're dishonest with themselves. Maybe they would never admit that they think there's fraud, but deep down they really think there is. They don't even want to admit that to their own mind. So I think insincerity is the biggest. I don't think it's in all cases, but I think it is in the lion's share of cases. Insincerity when it comes to denying the reality of voter fraud in this election cycle. Paul, anything to say about what Wojak brought up?
Yeah, I think it's much more serious than that. I think most of these people, who are applauding what's happening, consider Trump to be the equivalent of Adolf Hitler. And Biden is saving us from becoming something like the Third Reich. I know this is insane, but I keep running into these maniacs all the time who really believe stuff like this. Even family members who do. I mean, they really that Trump is at least as bad as Hitler. That we have to do everything we can to remove him from office. So even if this did happen, we should be proud that we did this. We save the country from an even worse fate. And if you read European newspapers, they sound the same. So I mean, Trump has been demonized because he is Hitler. I was asked to write an essay in an anthology put out by these academics on the nature, something about psychopathology in Trump or this of about 25 contributors, and these were mostly distinguished academics. I was the only one who said Trump was not a fascist. So, I mean, you sort of look at these. It's not even a question of whether this was done fairly or unfairly. This is irrelevant. The question is, will we save the United States from fascism? And Trump is or Hitlerism or something. And you see this in European newspapers too, all the time. So we're not even looking. These people are not even looking at whether the elections were carried out in procedurally sound fashion, or whether somebody in Atlanta or Philadelphia falsified a ballot. We're just lucky that we were saved from Trump.
Paul, it seems to me that these people who call.
Okay, so I'm kind of noticing a trend here. The certitude that people have with regard to such massive voter fraud that it has stolen the election from Donald Trump has in many cases been inversely proportionate to their knowledge of how voter fraud works. So generally speaking, it seems to me that most of those making the most intense claims that Donald Trump was robbed by voter fraud seem to know the least about voter fraud. Henry Olsen, who's a man of the left, writes an op-ed, man of the right, writes an op-ed here for the Washington Post, how we can be confident that Trump's voter fraud claims are baloney. So massive voter fraud should be relatively easy to detect. If fraud were behind President-elect Joe Biden's win, we should expect to see significantly higher turnout increases in key states when compared to the nation as a whole. Furthermore, we should expect to see higher turnout increases within those states in Democratic areas than in Republican areas, since those regions are places where Democrats are more likely to be able to hide any stolen votes. We should expect to see significantly larger shifts in voter margins toward the Democrats from other previous elections as the fraud alters the area's normal voting patterns. None of these early warning signs of fraud appear in the results. Voter turnout was up significantly almost everywhere compared with 2016. The huge turnout increases observed in battleground states such as Arizona, Georgia, Florida, and Texas is partially explained by their rapid population growth compared with the rest of the country. Turnout also rose by 15% or more over 2016 levels in 10 non-battleground states where there was no chance the race was ever going to be close. Voter enthusiasm rather than fraud is the most obvious explanation for the large increases in votes cast in swing states. Now, voter enthusiasm doesn't mean that voters were enthusiastic about Joe Biden. It may just mean that many voters were enthusiastic about removing Donald Trump. The results within swing states also do not support allegations of fraud. Take Wisconsin, for example. The 2020 map looks almost identical to the 2016 outcome, with Joe Biden flipping only 2 counties that Trump had narrowly carried. Trump's margins in rural and small metro area counties only narrowly changed from 2016, sometimes up a couple of points and sometimes down. Joe Biden's margins in the state's Democratic strongholds were not unusually high, nor was turnout noticeably higher there than in Trump regions. Trump's vote share increased in Milwaukee, and turnout in that deep blue county increased by less than 4%, compared with a 10% statewide increase. None of this is what one would expect to see if voter fraud drove the results. The same factors exist in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Biden flipped only 3 Michigan counties, each of which Trump had carried by only 3 points or less in 2016. Joe Biden flipped only 2 Pennsylvania counties, both of which are known as bellwethers that usually back the winner. Philadelphia is alleged to be the site of massive voter fraud, but it is reported fewer votes cast than in 2016 and is giving Biden a smaller vote lead than Hillary Clinton received. That's a pretty incompetent performance if the fix is in. All 3 states' results indicate what was to blame for Trump's defeat: suburban vote slippage. Trump's suburban margins dropped in deep red non-swing states as well, such as Louisiana, Kentucky, and Missouri. The president did significantly worse in suburbs in deep blue states such as Oregon and Washington. Trump's plaintive cry toward the end of his campaign for suburban women to, quote, "please like me," is more indicative of why Trump lost than anything he says now about fraud. Richard Hassan, professor of law and political science at the University of California, Irvine, one of America's top 100 lawyers, As an essay here in The Atlantic, Trump needs 3 consecutive Hail Mary passes. The president's litigation strategy is unlikely to succeed. So Biden appears very likely to win 306 electoral college votes, 36 more than he needs for the presidency. This is a comfortable lead. Recounts in even the closest states where the candidates are 10,000 to 20,000 votes apart are extremely unlikely to change the election results. The lawsuits filed in Pennsylvania and elsewhere are highly unlikely to go anywhere. The most recent complaint filed in federal court in Pennsylvania amounts to virtually nothing. Its core idea that the different procedures for voting by mail and voting in person constitute an equal protection violation is ludicrous. 5 states, for many voting cycles, have had primarily mail-in ballots, and we do not have evidence that there is disproportionate voter fraud in those states. The differences between mail-in and absentee voting were obvious for months. Nothing prevented the Trump's campaign from suing earlier over this. A late suit now is barred by a legal doctrine called laches, which says that you simply cannot wait until after an election you don't win to sue over an election problem you could see beforehand. Having different procedures for mail-in and in-person balloting does not create an equal protection violation. These quixotic lawsuits present no path towards an ultimate Trump victory. Trump campaign has not provided a good reason for a federal court to step in and delay certification, nor has the Trump campaign provided any evidence showing that there were tens of thousands of ballots cast illegally for Biden or of legal ballots not counted for Trump. Even if Trump somehow overturned the results in Pennsylvania, that would not be enough to flip the results in the Electoral College. In Arizona, where Biden now leads by about 12,000 votes, the Trump campaign has filed a lawsuit that could call at most 200 votes into question. And even overturning Pennsylvania and Arizona is not enough to make up for Biden being 36 votes beyond the Electoral College threshold. Now, what about the idea that state legislatures in Republican states could simply appoint a Republican slate of electors for Trump, thereby flipping the Electoral College? Is this cause for alarm? Bernard says, if voter fraud is not proven, I will probably reduce my watching of Scott Adams and Joseph Cotto. Robert says, had Trump made minimal efforts to act like a president, he would have had this in the bag. Rustin says, elections are just a way to achieve power. You can't win elections. You need to try other avenues, which now include the courts. Fraudulent votes or not, it may still give Trump a victory. Damn it, Luke is still refusing to jump on the voter fraud bandwagon. I am still refusing, but very much hoping that substantial evidence comes about that will allow me gratefully and happily to jump on the voter fraud bandwagon. We have nothing to lose. Let's run with voter fraud. Glib says mail-in ballots will ensure Democratic dominance as Democrats are lazier about physically showing up to the polls. Half Galician says Joseph Cotto's election night coverage was MAGA porn. Robert says, does Trump have a shot at this with Luke opposing him? I think not. Luke has become a debunker. Trump laughed like a populist, but having Ivanka do her Evita Peron trips to bakeries in Ohio was really off-putting. Trump was more of a nationalist than a populist. Trump was really a populist. He wouldn't have lost a crucial share of the white working class male vote. Trump made plenty of mistakes, or at least enough to cost him the race, beginning with tweets. People spend years analyzing movements behind the past 2 presidential elections. It just came down to normies voting for a person that turned them off the least, nothing thematic to extrapolate. Trump failed to directly take on the drug companies, which would have made him enormously popular. I suspect he lost because people don't like him. He achieved very little that will not be undone by Biden's executive orders. Well, what he achieved on the courts will not be undone. And Biden's advisors are also fighting over how much to undo of Trump's immigration work. People who voted for Trump really voted for Trump. People who voted for Biden really voted against Trump. least no civil unrest if since the election. Maybe Trump will start a podcast. Either Trump's people have solid evidence of voter fraud, they do not. If they have such evidence, they need to show it to a judge now. I thought I white-pilled Luke yesterday with the Steve Bannon video. Without Luke in the line, it surely will not hold. Robert says, don't agree, glib. Democrats were very motivated to vote against Trump by whatever means were at hand. Many voted early just because they were that eager to do so. Luke is looking sharp today. Damn, Mr. Ford is peak Chad. Biden's transition team is drawing up plans to make mail-in voting a permanent feature. Luke is the new Drudge going woke. All right, could state legislatures in Republican states simply appoint a Republican slate of electors for Trump, thereby flipping the Electoral College to him? To even talk of doing so would trigger massive unrest, put legislators under unprecedented pressure. Republican leader and Pennsylvania state senator said the legislature has no further role in choosing electors, though there's been some troubling talk more recently among Republican legislators to open inquiry into supposed election irregularities in the state. Legislatures would have no legal basis for going against voters' will. We are going down rabbit holes, and though surely there are some very dark possibilities, none of them is likely. Republicans know this, and they are just humoring Trump by allowing him to believe that he has a path to victory. But the humoring has a tremendous downside. That we are even having these discussions is itself concerning, says Bill Kristol. Even though the election results do not appear to be in doubt, what Trump and his team are doing is corrosive to democracy, which depends upon the losers accepting results as legitimate. The danger is less about whether Biden takes office in January, more about whether the American people will keep believing that this is a country that can settle its disagreements peacefully and through a legal process. That's law professor Richard Huzon.
Anything even of a Mitt Romney-like nature, fascist. And it seems like they truly have willed themselves to believe that anything that's not essentially a hardcore leftist is fascist. Mm-hmm. Stuff that they might even call Joe Lieberman a fascist at this stage. No joke. Right. But is that the impression you get from these people?
Well, there's degrees of disapproval. No one called Mitt Romney a fascist. They just said that he killed his employees, that they lived in horrible conditions, that he exploited other human beings, destroyed their lives. But they didn't really depict him as a danger to the survival of the United States as a free society or anything like that. They just made him so odious. You'd never vote. Anyway, he is odious for other reasons, but those are the reasons they gave. Joe Lieberman, they're disappointed, but he's pretty much of a conventional left liberal, except on foreign policy, which is more of a neoconservative, I suppose. There seems to be a special hatred for Trump because Trump fights back against them. Trump calls them names. He goes after. He's not a very effective speaker. He doesn't argue well. He's usually incoherent. But the very fact that he dares to attack the power structure makes him a very dangerous figure. And if there's anything which these young radicals support, it's the power structure. They're not rebels at all. They're just supporting the people who already have power and pretending they're out of power.
Well, it's interesting because I remember they called George W. Bush fascist as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I think this is just something they call anyone who's not on their side of the spectrum at this point. And they mean it, too. It's not necessarily even just rhetoric.
No, but they only call Democrats, they never call fascists, only Republicans.
Yeah, it's bizarre. But then again, so are so many other things. As we get to the last few super chats here from Forza, Jersey, how will Biden's COVID policy differ from Europe's? Europe's COVID policies, shall I say, have the stated intent of following science, yet they are seeing daily numbers that dwarf our own. It's interesting I think Biden will try to do some pretty draconian stuff. I don't know if he'll actually do a national law. This is presuming he's elected, of course. I don't think that he will be. But I think that there's a good chance the courts will prevent that from happening. I certainly don't think you'd have cooperation from the Republicans in the Senate. And it's worth noting that the Democrats now, such a slim majority of the U.S. House, they'll probably get even slimmer over the coming week. And then you have a majority technically yet, but they'll probably get one. But they'll have such a narrow majority problem when all said and done that I don't know if they'll have a lot of wiggle room to do unpopular stuff in the House with regards to COVID measures. So who knows? If Biden's elected, his COVID policy might not wind up being much of anything between the courts, between the U.S. Senate, and the U.S. House. Paul, anything to say about what Forza Jersey brought up?
Yeah, I don't know quite what the guy's going to do. I hope he has a general lockdown and the economy goes bust. That's because I'm a catastrophist and hoping that he totally wrecks everything and does it fast so I can live to see the outcome because I'm old, but I want to see the outcome of this. I'm not joking. I think the soccer moms and the other idiots, virtue signalers, have to be taught a lesson. And of course, they'll blame it on Trump. They'll find some way to blame it on Trump that he caused the virus or some nonsense. But that stuff doesn't go on. That doesn't work for very long because now the other side is in charge. one of the things I thought could happen is they'll simply decide there's no more COVID once he becomes president. Because the reason they were pushing this stuff was because Trump was in the White House. Now they use that to get rid of Trump. So if he becomes president, they don't have to have the COVID anymore, or else they can just use it to do what.
And Robert says, how much pro-Trump material are you going to read in the Washington Post or the New York Times? Well, I'd say perhaps 5% of their coverage and opinion columns about Trump are positive.
What's her name? Whitmer in Michigan has done, or Wolf has tried. Basically, you use it against your enemies on the right. Whereas you allow your, Black Lives Matter can riot or this. So, but even that is not going to work, because now if Black Lives Matter starts rioting, they're the Biden voters who are doing this, and it's the Biden administration. So you can't blame this on Trump anymore. I don't think there's going to be any more success. Trump was actually the best of the bunch. I agree. He handled it, no matter what he said, no matter how stupidly opposed to masks or whatever it was. He generally did the right thing. I cannot believe that the Democrats will do the right thing. They'll probably make it much worse. And the infection rates and the death. The only thing that might save them is a vaccine, for which the media will give them credit if it comes along.
And from last Biden takes over. When do you anticipate a second full-scale lockdown like we saw back in March 8th?
Regionalism.
Supporting the show, Beers 87. From CT001. America is lost. Just build a no-go zone and establish a community. You don't need to save America at this point. Just save your friends and family while you still can. And I won't say the rest of that, not reasonable or responsible. But I will say that I think the longer that the United States is not a coherent country by now, it's an entity with many competing quasi-countries within it. And I think that there's really no point looking at America as a unified country at this stage. Regionalism is the future, and that's what I would encourage people to focus on, primarily when it comes to political involvement. Paul, anything to say about what CT001 brought up that I just mentioned?
Yeah, I agreed with the first part of your statement, not necessarily with the second. I think the country is sort of broken up into these parts that don't quite fit together. There are cultural, social conflicts.
Breaking news: Jeffrey Toobin has been fired by the New Yorker after 36 years of service. I wonder how he's going to handle it.
Internal contradictions that I don't think can be transcended at this point. And I'd be delighted if the country would break up into regions, and they would have semi-autonomous regions. The problem is I don't quite know how it's going to work, because regionalism doesn't really exist anymore. It existed, when I was a kid, like the South was a distinct cultural.
And the audacity of Cope responds, this may feel like a tough haul, Jeffrey, but I feel you can pull through it, eventually come back and rub it in everyone's face. This is no moment to slack off. Seize the opportunity and flog it for all it is worth. Are we ready? Is America ready for the Jeffrey Toobin comeback tour? I feel like what America needs right now is Jeffrey Toobin. Like, American democracy is hanging in the balance. We have all these legal Trump challenges. We need Jeffrey Toobin to pull it together and to grace us with his legal, political, social, and cultural analysis. Now more than ever, we need Toobin. Let Toobin flog it all he wants. Maybe you can just elevate the camera so we just have Jeffrey Toobin from the neck up. And whatever Toobin wants to do below the neck, that's his business. He's a man in his 50s. I don't think he's going to be sending his spunk flying up, to hit the ceiling like a vigorous 17-year-old. So let Toobin flog it all he wants. Just keep the camera from the neck up, and let Toobin bang. Let Toobin flog it. Let Toobin seize the moment. Let Toobin rub it in everyone's faces. Let Toobin be Toobin. Why can't we just get over something that I'm sure we've all done one time or another? Who hasn't whacked it on a Zoom call with colleagues? I mean, when you're there looking through Zoom at Masha Gessen, who among us can say that they could stare upon the visage of Masha Gessen without feeling an overwhelming desire to ease one's tension, just kind of release the mighty python out of its cage and flog it for all you're worth? I mean, we need Toobin now more than ever. And here, I'll do the sign language interpretation right now. Let Toobin flog, let Toobin bang. Let Toobin do whatever he wants to do. Just keep the camera from the neck up. We need Toobin's legal analysis. American democracy is hanging in the balance. Now, some of those writers from the New Yorker are mighty attractive. Like, press 1 in the chat if you've never flogged it to the visage of one of those mighty fine New Yorker writers. I mean, it's just that most of us are not put in the peril that Jeffrey Toobin was put in, right? Imagine that you were getting on a Zoom call, and you were coming face to face, with these mighty fine, really attractive New Yorker writers. During Zoom calls, keep your pants on. It's not prudishness. It's white male privilege. Okay, that's one opinion. But most of us don't get this kind of stimulation. All right? So we think, oh, we'd never do something like that. But how many of us have been on a Zoom call with Marcia Gasson? Or, that editor dude at the New Yorker, or any of those fine looking journalists at the New Yorker. Like, we think that we're immune to that temptation. Like, you think, here I am, I stand before you, no fap for almost 7.5 years. And you really think that when we're talking about voter fraud, that I never experience a temptation to just rub one out? You don't think that whenever I get frustrated having an argument, I don't ever think, oh, I'd really like to release some tension right now? You don't think that, I imagine that I've got enough self-discipline that I could keep talking about voter fraud with the one hand and stroke it with the other? But I cannot even face that possibility, because there I'd go. Like, there but for the grace of God go I. I mean, we've all flogged it. We've all Toobined it. America needs to get over its hang-ups. What we need right now is Jeffrey Toobin back on the air. What is a Zoom call? To Toobin or not to Toobin? That's the question. Should you be lubing your Toobin? Yeah, remember when I used to turn the camera off while I was streaming? Was I pulling a Toobin, or was I just having a bad hair day? I mean, we're all sinners. We all have weaknesses. And to think that we should, fire a man of Jeffrey Toobin, of his sterling legal analysis. Think about all the great books that he gave us. He gave us the book on the Florida recount in year 2000. He gave us the book on O.J. Simpson. He gave us the book on Patty Hearst. He's given us so much pleasure through his CNN legal analysis. I think after a man has given so much pleasure to other people through his legal analysis, shouldn't he be allowed to just unzip and refresh himself with a little bit of his own pleasure? Like, think about how Jeffrey Toobin has touched your life. Think about the hours and hours of stimulation that he has provided you. Think about how you read his book on O.J. Simpson, and how you'd turn the pages with one hand and you'd be lubing and Toobin with the other hand. Right now he's got that book out on Patty Hearst. Like, who among us can say that they read Jeffrey Toobin's book on Patty Hearst and they didn't rub one out every 10 pages? So it's easy for people who haven't contributed as much pleasure and intellectual stimulation to America as Jeffrey Toobin to condemn him. But after all the stimulation that he has given Americans with his CNN analyses, with his New Yorker essays, with his learned books, think about the tug that he has exerted on the American brain, the influence he's had on our jurisprudence. And now we're going to judge him? I mean, Lucy says, Luke, sometimes I watch pornos while listening to you in the background. I feel like you're not judging me. But if it was E. Michael Jones, I would feel wrong. This is a no judgment zone. This is a place of radical love and inclusion. Wow. Does anyone have an email for Jeffrey Toobin? I want to get him on the show right now. we need Toobin more than ever. What's his email address? Come on, guys. Come up. Jeffrey Toobin on Twitter. Okay. Oh, man, I can't even message Jeffrey Toobin. Oh, jeffreytoobin.com. Where's the about? There's the about section, but there's no contact section. So, guys, get me an email. I need an email for Jeffrey Toobin. His latest book is True Crimes and Misdemeanors, the investigation of Donald Trump. Like, I want to know what Jeffrey Toobin thinks about this situation our country confronts now. Like, more than ever, America needs Toobin, and we'll just keep the camera angle from the neck up.
Sociological entity. The same thing was certainly true about the Plain States and the Scandinavians and Germans and others who settled there and so forth. And the West Coast had its own. But by now, this is, I mean, you've had such cross migrations of population and people settling and resettling, homogenizing leftist culture. It used to be just a Hollywood culture, but it wasn't that bad in the 1950s when I was growing up. Now it's toxic. But it's like reaching the entire. And then, of course, public education has been sort of become standardized throughout the country, and it teaches pretty much the same leftist values everywhere. So I don't know exactly how this regionalism is going to work. If people ask me, I'm a regionalist, I said I'd like to be one, but we pretty much destroyed regions by now, or the distinct identities of regions. What I would be happy to do is allow all of the deplorables to live in certain places, and the other people can have the cities, or something like that. I promise never again in my probably short lifetime by now to wander into one of these cities. I wouldn't even go there if I could avoid them. And I would just, cling to my borough here, or to rural Pennsylvania or other rural areas.
I don't blame you. From Rod Brett, I think it's the second to last one. A new Hans Hermann.
Okay, boy, let me try to pull it together here. When I just think about what poor Jeffrey Toobin has gone through, like he didn't deserve that, mate. He did not deserve that. My heart goes out to him. So Washington Post has an essay here. Trump's lawyers suffer embarrassing rebukes by judges over voter fraud claims. The common thread running through all of these cases is that Trump's lawyers are regularly offering a significantly more watered-down version of Trump's claims about rampant voter fraud because they, unlike Trump, have to substantiate their claims. And as these exchanges show, it is a rather thankless task that can quickly land them on a judge's bad side. All right, we need some.
Oh, Nicole, hi. It's nice to see you. I mean,
Hi.
Sort of see you. To be with you. Nice to be with you. Yeah. Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Hi.
Who knew? I guess Trump.
Hi.
Hi.
It's been a long time since we sat here.
I know.
It's weird, we've had some dark days. We've gone through this thing, and it seems like when these dark days happen, somehow I end up here.
Thank God.
I've been away for
That's by my design,
I've been away for 3.5 weeks, and I came back, and here we are together sharing this moment. To kind of come back to a topic you and I have discussed. Hi, Nicole, by the way. Happy Friday. How you doing?
Hi. Happy
you
Friday.
surprised me
Nice
with
to
that
see
short.
you.
You surprised me with that short question. Well, I think, Nicole, hi, happy Wednesday, by the way. It's good to see you. I miss you.
I miss you
I'm sitting
too.
here in Wisconsin, and thinking, I need a little Nicole in my life on a Wednesday to help me get through the rest of this week.
What's going on?
Hey, Nicole, how are you?
Hi, friend.
What's going on up there? Right. Can I say something first, Nicole? Hi,
Please.
nice to see you.
Hi.
I mean, not see you, but you know what I mean. It's awesome to be with you. I love having Fridays with you, and I miss you so much.
I miss you so much.
I can't stand it that we're not together for all these weeks. Somehow we got through.
I saw nothing but all the love for you. So thank you. Thank you.
Glad you had a nice vacation.
Thank you.
We missed you, though.
I needed that.
There it is. There he is.
Oh.
He always wants to be on with you. Oh my God, this is my life right here. Look at
You
this,
got a
these
good
two
life.
beasts.
You got a good life, my
They both
friend.
miss
I
you
love
desperately.
them.
They miss you
Well,
desperately.
let's
They say
get
hello.
them a
They
show.
say, "Where's Nicole?" I know.
The reason you were fired from The View was not because you didn't know who Omarosa was. It was because the universe knew that we needed you here. That's the first
I
thing.
love you.
The second.
Thank you so much, my friend. Here today. The next hour of Deadline White House, Heilemann, you'll always do. I'm just kidding. You're my first choice. I was just trying to work more people in. Can you weigh in on the irony that we are having this Me Too moment?
A little teeny weeny bit awkward. James says, Luke, what do you make of the reports that come out about some or most, I would say, I would expect the overwhelming number of the donations to the fraud investigations are really being funneled to pay for Republican Georgia runoffs and Trump's campaign debt. Yes, I believe that is true. Almost everything I'm seeing about the Trump fraud claims look spacious, and it looks like a massive grift, and it looks like a humoring of Trump's ego. So I am open to that there is a serious element here that's going to transform the country. And in the chat, Peter Levy says he already Toobin 3 times today. Bro, it's no fap November. Do I think Trump will concede? Yes, I do. Eventually. Maybe in January. Toobin's in for some awkward Hanukkah conversations this year. Has America turned into a nation of Toobinizers? Toobin tugs, the alt-right shrugs. Okay, so very important tweet came out this morning, 10:35 a.m. my time. Benford's Law. Charlie Kirk, noted political analyst, noted legal scholar. Charlie Kirk, noted statistician, tweeted Benford's Law. So you might have heard a lot about Benford's Law over the past week. You probably never heard about Benford's Law previously. It's the law of anomalous numbers, or the first digit law. It's an observation about the frequency distribution of leading digits in many real-life sets of numerical data, and it is used for accounting fraud detection and in election data, macroeconomic data, price digit analysis, genome data, and scientific fraud detection and COVID data. But someone came out and claimed that the 2020 election results violated Benford's Law, given that 99.99% of Americans never heard of Benford's Law. And yet suddenly people are convinced that there's massive fraud because someone has posted an essay showing, what was it, regressive analysis, that supposedly that the election results violate Benford's Law. So there is a political scientist who has done a great amount of work in this area. And he is at the University of Michigan. His name's Walter Mabane. And he was the first to apply the second-digit Benford's Law test in election forensics. Such analyses are considered a simple, though not foolproof, method of identifying irregularities in election results and helping to detect electoral fraud. Now, many scholars have argued that Benford's Law is problematic and misleading as a statistical indicator of electoral fraud. So whether or not it is useful in detecting electoral fraud is a matter of controversy. But the guy who's done more to argue that you can use Benford's Law to detect electoral fraud, well, he's posted a paper today denying that Benford's Law has anything to do with the 2020 elections. Walter Mabane. So he posted a paper yesterday. As vote counting is drawing to a close in the 2020 presidential election, some are claiming that application of Benford's Law to the precinct vote counts from a few counties and cities gives evidence of election fraud. Not true. It's widely understood that the first digits of precinct vote counts are not useful for trying to diagnose election frauds. The first digit is largely determined by the number of voters in each precinct. The share of the votes received by parties or candidates does not vary all that greatly across precincts. To date, I have not heard of any substantial irregularities having occurred anywhere, and the particular data sets examined in this paper give essentially no evidence that election frauds occurred. So this is the statistician and professor of political science who has done the most analyses using Benford's Law to try to detect election fraud, and he's not coming up with anything. So he says there's no reason to believe it has any application to the
I'm Greg
2020
Johnson.
election.
Welcome to Countercurrents Radio. We are doing another one of our Sunday live streams. Special one. We have some very special guests lined up. Our first guest is Jared Taylor. We're also going to be joined by Mark Weber and Sam Dixon. And Jason Kessler is coming in as well. And the topic for today is basically our thoughts about the election that's not really over like we all wished it were. What we can do as a movement, what's likely to happen in the aftermath of this election, given various possible outcomes. Also, one of the things that we do is we use these live streams as a fundraising opportunity.
Okay, Dovid, how are you, sir?
Excellent.
Okay, great. So, do you have any opening thoughts, or should I start us off?
Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to start us off by playing something here from Marc Shapiro.
A nice article about him by Professor Jonathan Boyarin, who studied with him. Much of this comes out of Boyarin's book that appeared last month called Yeshiva Days. He's an anthropologist. He earlier wrote a book about his time at the Stanton Street Synagogue. He likes to sit and observe and listen and write about it. That's what anthropologists do. But he's been learning in Ramosha's yeshiva now for a long time, or he was, and he wrote the whole study of, as it says, an intimate and moving portrait of daily life in New York's oldest institution of traditional rabbinic learning. When they say the oldest institution, that is not correct, though. Yeshivas Rabbi Elchanan is older, and Torah Vodaas is older. But okay, and he's a very good anthropologist. Now, if you want to get a sense over who he was, I recommend going to, you can, Yeshiva World News, other places, you can watch the eulogies, the Hespedim of Rav Moshe, of Rav Dovid. We're fortunate that two family members spoke. I have to say, and I hope this isn't disrespectful, that often when you listen to great rabbis' funerals, you have older rabbis speaking and it sounds like drushes. And you come away from it not knowing anything about the people. We were fortunate that for Rav Dovid, his son spoke. His son wouldn't remember me. I made my name. He wouldn't. I think he would remember me because he was very helpful to me 30 years ago. He brought me into Ramosha's small apartment. They still had the apartment after his grandparents are no longer alive, and he let me look through Ramosha's papers to find letters from Yechiakov Weinberg, and I found a number of letters. So I'm very grateful to him for that. And then Rav Dovid's grandson, who I know quite well, a number of people on this in this class must remember him as well. For all the comments he used to make on the classes, he told me he hasn't been here for the last few months because he's busy with the great zechus he had helping with his grandfather. But I think you can listen to both these Hespedim, and you get a sense of the righteousness, the sikus, the hasmada, the learning, the personality.
So a Hespedim is a praising of a rabbi or praising of a Jew after he dies. It's a traditional Jewish practice. Dovid, anything you want to say about Hespedim or anything you've heard there from Mark?
Yeah, maybe overall framing that you get a large audience that isn't always directly into the finer details of Orthodox Judaism. Obviously the question of funerals, Dovid Feinstein passing away, the son of Rav Moshe Feinstein, largely considered, pardon me, the Poisek Ador, the ruler in Jewish law, definitively in America. I think he's actually cousins with the Rav Soloveitchik of YU, and Marc Shapiro is the dissonance of probably like me and Luke Ford, especially in like the modern Orthodox Zionist people that me and Luke probably affiliate in our local minyanim or our neighborhoods because that's kind of geographically the sectarianism that we might fall into. Where the people we want, we're modern Orthodox, so we want to fit in, make sure so well that we're in with the Orthodox, like we're following. Even Rav Moshe Feinstein wouldn't have any problems with what we're doing, but then to the larger audience or Jews that we deal with, like no one cares whether we meet the standards of Rav Moshe Feinstein, and a lot of people may not have even heard of Rav Moshe Feinstein. So it's always very interesting the method that Marc Shapiro uses to do it. I define myself as apology, even though Luke doesn't, because it seems to me like you also sent me that blog that he denounced the Peleg protesters in Jerusalem, but where he's kind of trying to diminish the extreme Judaism and say that doesn't really speak for the text, and he could speak to the text, but from my perspective is like I like the extremist, and it seems that I'd rather just say the extremists are extreme, but those people are extreme largely because they're trying to follow Judaism to the best of their ability, as opposed to apologizing and trying to make Judaism more amenable to the goyim.
Okay, let me play more here.
It obviously is a great loss. Rav Dovid was a posek, a Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't really write. Maybe he wrote and didn't publish it. And his son described how it was only after his father passed away that he really came into his own. But it is a great loss. And one thing in particular that the son said that struck me, and it reminds me very much like a Brisker mentality. He said at the end, his father couldn't fast. Rav Dovid couldn't fast on Yom Kippur. But he wasn't upset. Why should he be upset? That's obviously the Ratzon Hashem. Now he's weak. So his job is not to fast. And that's what makes, that's halacha. For a person like that, the feelings aren't what is important. The feelings go through the halacha. And the halacha is he had to eat. So of course, that's what...
Dovid, so I think the biggest difference between the way Jewish law is practiced and the way non-Jews or secular Jews expect from Jewish law is that they think it's some kind of heartless system that does not take into consideration contingencies. So, for example, most everyone knows that on Yom Kippur, Jews fast. But not only is it a mitzvah, a divine commandment, to fast on Yom Kippur, but if you are too weak, or if you're pregnant, or if there are other reasons where it would put your life in danger to fast on Yom Kippur, not only are you exempt from fasting on Yom Kippur, you are commanded to eat and drink on Yom Kippur, because overall the Jewish legal system is something that Jews are to live by, not to die for, with rare exceptions. David, any comments?
Yeah, I think that was a theme of our talks before when we were doing Torah regularly, that largely in Jewish law, the major exceptions are health, livelihood, sometimes like safety and security. But health and livelihood are unquestionably always things that could overrule Jewish law. And the flavor of the Jewish community in the various places we live is usually because we did what we had to do to stay healthy and get ahead. So another difference, I was just thinking that between the modern Orthodox and the ultra Orthodox is, the modern Orthodox might like to be in line with the rulings of Rav Moshe Feinstein, but they weren't we're not really followers, even like Hasidim. But Orthodox people are generally followers. So it wasn't just Rav Moshe was the Poisek Gador. People really took his advice and lived it. People would ask him who they should marry, where they should live, what type of business, and not necessarily in a blind way where people were just drones and did whatever the rabbi said, but I guess as a way of minimizing dissonance, where the people felt that they were safer going with the rabbi's recommendation. And the modern Orthodox school, saying, me and Luke, we probably consult rabbis all day. If you have a major issue, I might speak to 10 different rabbis, but at the end of the day, I'm going to make my own decision under the consultation of rabbis. In the more traditional Orthodox way, people superstitiously, because they believe, not because they're drones and just do whatever the rabbis say, put a lot of weight and follow the rabbis. So Dovid Feinstein, he wasn't great like his father to be the Poisek Gador, but he was still probably one of the bigger rulers in America, especially things like medical law or unique things to America that the big Gedolim in Israel wouldn't know. But in terms of followership, in terms of the people who, like the cultish type community, Reb Dovid filled in the steps of the shoes of his father and, so to say, inherited his followers. And I'm not sure if that's dwindled. If you read like Art Scroll, the founders of Art Scroll are basically followers of Rav Moshe Feinstein, that every major difficulty that they had, they basically went to Rav Moshe Feinstein and did what he recommended, and with consultation of other sages, and then they went to Rav Dovid Feinstein. So I'm not sure. It could be a big deal in the Jewish world, because like people like Marc Shapiro, big scholars, we like them, but in the Orthodox world, there's known big rabbis, and that's where the businessmen, that's where the people go to consult with.
Wait, I'm not following. What might be a big deal?
Well, I mean, who are the big Jewish Orthodox men of America going to go to with the most difficult questions now that Rav Dovid Feinstein has passed away?
Right.
The Novominsker Rebbe, passed away, and I don't think it's going to be his son. I mean, I think he has kids. It might be another Feinstein. I mean, there's plenty of big rabbis, but at a certain point, there may not be. It may not be important to because usually these big issues relate to things like medical halacha or business or certain things. But in certain business fields, that could be a big deal. What rabbi people go to.
Okay, let me play more here from Marc Shapiro.
Also, there was talk by the son, things we mentioned in the Mimetic tradition, that Masorah was very important. I guess in a sense he's not, quote, orthodox from what it is today, because today with all the new ideas that often new chumras, new changes, things, Rav Dovid was about Masorah. So if you come to him, what you found in the Sefer or something, he says, but that's not the minhag. And I want to show you just, there's a number of interesting videos you can find online. One of them is, you see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a parah aduma, looks like a red cow, with Dovid going to visit it outside of Lakewood. It's very unusual to have a red cow. But there's a video from the Halachic Organ Donor Society, and I'll just play you a minute of it, because in other videos, you see this also with Rav Dovid. He really, he says it like it is. And the issue is, how do you define death? Because if you define death as a lack of breathing, well, then that they brain death. You're no longer breathing anymore. But many people hold that it's not that. It's also, it has to be the stopping of a heartbeat, which means you can't have heart transplants or anything like that. So you can just hear Rav Dovid just saying it shortly. He doesn't even, if you listen later, he doesn't even want to get into debates. He does say he doesn't know if his father doesn't think his father would approve of the organ donor cards, because he says that then you put the organ in like a bank. But we know that's not true. As far as I know, organ donor, you take it in immediately. But just listen, he's very strong and very no nonsense.
My father's position was very simply that the stopping of breathing is a point of that's death. It doesn't matter if the heart is functioning or it doesn't function. So long as he stops breathing, he's considered dead. That's the way he explained the Gemara in Human. That's the way he said they always did in Europe when the Clever Kadisha went to test if a person is dead or not. He always used to test his breathing and nothing else. I'll repeat again the same thing. If the breathing has stopped, then he's considered dead. And that's it. Nothing else.
Even if the heart's still beating.
Right.
Right.
And anything else is not a criterion.
Okay, so very interesting there. Now, as for Jonathan Sacks, who I did know, what can we say? First of all, it was an enormous shock. We heard a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I think it is, that he had cancer. And I assumed, as I think everyone else did, that this was like something beginning stages and, like everyone else. He'd go through chemo and hopefully things would be okay. But it came very quickly and it was quite shocking. I asked a rabbi in England today, and he also said that they had no idea that it was so serious, and it came as a shock to them as well. There's a lot we can say. Hold on a second. About Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. First, if you want to hear, unlike Rav Dovid, Rabbi Sacks had a very small funeral. You can see video if you go to his website. Just a very, unlike Rav Dovid, which is very large, very small funeral. In fact, I watched the eulogies today. I didn't know what those little flowers were. I asked the same rabbi today that I mentioned about Rabbi Sacks. I asked him, what's this? These little flowers, and he told me they call it the remembrance poppy. That's they start wearing it a few days before Armistice Day, which is coming up on Wednesday. It's the 11th. Remember, if the war ended, World War I, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and that's Stein Beanstalk, and you can see the other eulogies there. And there's so much important things. I think probably the best article I saw was this one. No, that's the remembrance poppy I want to show you. Hold on, where is it? Here. By Alon Goshen Gottstein, who wrote about, he focused mostly on Rabbi Sacks's involvement with interfaith, because that's his thing. There's so much to say about Jonathan Sacks. Let me just say in 3 minutes and tell you about a personal experience, because I think it says something about him. He's obviously going to be someone that we write about for a long, long time. The fact that the leading Jewish public intellectual was an Orthodox rabbi really says something. I don't know where he found the time for all the reading. He reviewed my first book, actually. He reviewed, and he wrote so much. You wouldn't have expected what he became when he was an earlier rabbi, and even when he became chief rabbi. At first, he's writing to the Jewish community, and then he begins writing for the world at large. He becomes the most popular clergyman in England. He's speaking on the BBC, elsewhere, and he becomes an international figure. And the rabbi everyone knows, with enormous influence. He was successful beyond anything anyone can imagine. And the one area, perhaps you can say, it wasn't so successful, or people didn't like it, is being a chief rabbi. Because what happened was he became this international figure. It's as if you have your local pulpit rabbi publishes a book, it becomes a bestseller, and every day he's being interviewed and going around the world. People in the community are going to feel, well, what about us? And I would go to England usually once or twice a year to speak when things were normal. And I would always hear that when he was chief rabbi, that he's so famous in America and around the world and among the non-Jews, but I think many of the local Jews in England, but when you think about it, felt that they were missing out. But England's a small Jewish community, and the chief rabbinate, it has an august title, but it represents the United Synagogue, represents really a very small number of Jews. The Haredi aren't represented at all by it. So it's easy to see how Rabbi Sachs very quickly, and read the biographies, he really grew out of this. And although he continued as chief rabbi, the things that I guess they wanted him to do, he was so beyond that, and he became the moral voice, and it's just that you can go on and on. So let me just tell you one quick story I had with him. I didn't know him that well. We corresponded and other things, but I came to England in 2008. I looked it up because I was over Shavuos. I was at the St. John's Wood Synagogue. It's a very nice synagogue there, and Sachs asked to speak to me beforehand. And we had a nice conversation, and then at the end, he gave me Musar. Now, I told this to some people later. They found it strange. I don't find it strange. I didn't take offense, and it's exactly who he was. He said to me, he reads my blog posts, he does all these things, and he said to me, now it's time to move on. Bigger and better things. He says, I want you to write for the Wall Street Journal. I want you to, he wanted me to be a public intellectual, not just in our little world. He got his wish later, Mayor Soloveitchik. I guess that's that. He said that you have something to say. He says, I want you to do like I'm doing. And that's his whole message. And in fact, Goshen Gottstein in his article also mentioned it here that Rabbi Sachs was able to expand the we of Judaism, addressed by our particular wisdom, make it the we of all religions and all of humanity. The idea was that he really believed in this, that we have what to offer. And what can I say? It's not my interest. I speak to the small groups. I'd rather write about an obscure sefer from 150 years ago for the few people who are interested in that. But I understood what he was saying, and I took it as a great compliment that he thought I could do that. I don't think necessarily I could do that. I mean, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik does it amazingly, and you need to have a certain approach. But that really said who he was, and that it was time to really move beyond parochial and really fulfill this like Hirschian vision of taking, because the Torah is not just for the Jews. Torah values are supposed to be for the world. Sometimes we forget about this. And there was no one, his predecessor was very good at this, Emanuel Jacobowitz. But Rabbi Sachs really went way beyond, and there'll be doctorates written on him and discussions. I wrote a whole article dealing with his views of religion. So that's what I can say about Rabbi Sachs. Just 2 more minutes before we move on. I just want to call your attention to a couple other things. First, we ended last class, Baruch correcting me with...
Okay, Dovid, anything there that you want to comment on?
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. There's a lot of things, and I was thinking, because I'm not exactly sure, maybe it's thanks to you, maybe just karma in general. I'm going to have Dr. Ed Dutton on my channel next week, Tuesday, from a super chat from Yehuda Finkelstein. And just watching that, I was thinking that Marc Shapiro is a lot like Ed Dutton in a lot of ways, and like anthropologist. And as an Orthodox Jew, this makes a lot of sense. Like every Friday at a lot of synagogues, between Mincha and Mariv, the rabbi gives a halacha, sometimes every day after Shacharis. In a lot of days, the morning prayers, and a lot of times they'll discuss the history and origins of rituals. That's a topic of sermons, and not usually like sermons when the women and children are there, but when there's a short period of time and it's just men. It's a very common sermon topic, rituals. Why do we do it the way we do it, and what's the origin of that? And so Marc Shapiro specializes it, and I was looking at Dr. Dutton, because he's written like hundreds of articles. He's written reviews on hundreds of books, and on his own webpage, he calls himself, he likes controversial topics. And for me and Jennifer, I like the joy of figuring things out, like the physics book about Richard Feynman. I just enjoy understanding things. So Marc Shapiro is not an anthropologist. He's in Judeo studies, but I was just thinking about that. I mean, I know you've spoken to Dutton, you probably like him, and just listening to Marc Shapiro say, like, he's an academic that just has his thoughts, and maybe you compare like Richard Spencer to, Dutton is just like Marc Shapiro. Dutton isn't going to lead a movement. He might have ideas that are interesting to a guy like Richard Spencer. So just like Marc Shapiro, he's in the entourage of Shiner and Ellie Shiner and various people that do actually go around the world and are part of big international Jewry, or these rabbis that actually make rulings. If you think your main synagogue rabbi, conversion's a big deal, because there's converts and people want to know, can you trust them or not? But in reality, it's not that important. Like, unless you're going to marry your daughter to a convert, you don't really need to know, how kosher they are. Like, people might look into it, but medical halacha is probably the pinnacle of these type things. Like the big rabbis, they probably get pounded most days, like kosher, is the dish good? can they eat this person's food? And the more serious topics are usually related to medicine. It's like, I love being a Jew. I know tons of lawyers and tons of doctors, intellectual people, and we think about these things constantly. So Dovid Feinstein, in many ways, is representative of the greatest of Orthodox Judaism of this generation. I mean, people might have disputes on that, but he was a great mind who people asked him the difficult questions about situations where people were dying or had terminal illnesses, and there were conflict with the Jewish law, just questions what the best way of Jewish law, and he became the expert in America. So it's pretty interesting. And someone like Marc Shapiro is kind of like Dutton, like he just likes what's interesting to him. So Dutton's going to come out with his next video, and it's like, well, why are you telling me this? He's like, well, it's just interesting to me. And so I guess that's kind of like Marc Shapiro. I don't know if you agree with that comparison of Dutton to Shapiro.
No, I think Dutton's much more. Dutton's unique, so I can't really classify Dutton. He's a contrarian, and he's a provocateur, and Shapiro has elements of that, but I think they're very, very different people. Let me play more here from Shapiro.
Possible that the Rav did not agree when he wrote Halachic Man with what he wrote. You can have a different perspective. That's how I see it. And one more point of this stuff. Rabbi Leib sent me something that Rav Aaron Soloveitchik wrote. I actually knew what Rav Aaron Soloveitchik wrote. I didn't know it. He sent me, I guess from some website maybe or something. I knew it from this. This is called Yelch Pashuim. It's Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. And here you have not only a defense of Moshe Soloveitchik, but I don't even know how to answer it. It's on page 558 to 559. This book appeared in, it appeared a few years ago. This is actually edition 2. Edition 1, which I also have, it might have been due to me, but I suggested to him that it isn't proper for it to be spread about, because some of the stories in edition 1 are just so crazy. And I don't leave it at that. But even this volume has some interesting stories. But he learned something from this, first of all, very unusual. Well, take it not very unusual, very enlightening. Everyone who read Halachic Man assumed that the story took place in Chaslovich. Moshe Soloveitchik was the Rav in Chaslovich. That's where Soloveitchik grew up, and that was a Chabad town to a certain extent. That's where Soloveitchik had his Chabad Muhammad. However, when you read Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, you see that the story took place in Washington Heights. He tells the story took place at Beis Medrash Haggadah on 175th Street. And the Baal Tokeo was a man by the name of Avram Radin. He calls him a big Baal Bechi. He would cry a lot. And he tells the story that before he started to blow the shofar, he started to cry. My father didn't like it. And here, actually, he quotes it as saying, so I don't know, maybe there's another version floating around out there, but he quotes him as saying that when you eat matzahs, do you cry? And he does the whole story there. But then he goes further. He explains what's going on here. If you look in Nehemiah, in chapter 8, it tells the story that the people, which if you look in Rashi there, it tells us it's Rosh Hashanah. And the people started crying. And what is here? I think I have it here. I can, oh yes, I'll pull it up here. Where are we now? I'll show you the pasuk. Look in, it's in pasuk 9. The people started weeping. And what did Ezra, and this is Rosh Hashanah, Rashi tells us, and that seems to be Pshat also. This day is holy unto the Lord our God, mourn not nor weep. So here we have an explicit pasuk that on Rosh Hashanah you're not supposed to weep. So Rav Aaron tells us that's the basis. He says to him, if you want to cry when you eat a matzah, that you can. He tells him straight out that you can cry if you want when you eat a matzah. You can't cry on Rosh Hashanah. So now I ask all the people who criticize Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, it's an explicit pasuk in Nehemiah, it seems.
Okay, anything there grab your attention, Dovid?
Not specifically.
Okay, that's fine. Let me move on. That wasn't actually the clip that I wanted to play. Here, let me move on.
Country which gives freedom. It's a malchus shel chesed. It's a kingdom of mercy. That's like a common expression in the Haredi world. Even Moshe Feinstein uses it, referring to America as a malchus shel chesed. In previous classes, I pointed out that you'll never see modern Orthodox people use that phrase. I can't imagine the Rav using it because that implies that the Jews are subjects and the ruler is being kind. If you have a different conception of government, that we're all involved. This isn't a dictatorship or monarchy. This is
yeah. So I think that's an important difference. I played that for you on Sunday, but let me just repeat it. So in the Haredi perspective, Jews in the diaspora are essentially subjects of the Gentile government, while from a modern Orthodox perspective, Jews are part of the nation, part of the people. They're not separate from. This is so good. Let me just rewind this 1 minute here of analysis from Shapiro.
We've been taught. On the other hand, he says in the second paragraph, we see that even in Europe, they would vote. And they would, and the great rabbis would encourage people to vote. And if we go against this, if we announce we're not voting, this will create ava, enmity, especially in this country, which gives freedom. It's a malchus shel chesed. It's a kingdom of mercy. That's like a common expression in the Haredi world. Even Moshe Feinstein uses it, referring to America as a malchus shel chesed. In previous classes, I pointed out that you'll never see modern Orthodox people use that phrase. I can't imagine the rest.
Yeah, so the Haredim will regard, say, the United States of America as a kingdom of mercy, but you won't hear the modern Orthodox using that phrase.
Using it because that implies that the Jews are subjects and the ruler is.
Right, because it implies that the Jews are subjects, and from a modern Orthodox perspective, Jews are citizens. So from a Haredi perspective, Jews in the diaspora are subjects of a Gentile power. From a modern Orthodox perspective, Jews are citizens with equal rights. Any thoughts, Dovid?
Yeah, and you could give a more extreme approach towards Judaism, to Haredim, to the Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. America is a country of mercy because it's easy to be a full practicing Jew in America. So you have Hasidim and ultra-Orthodox people that don't even speak much English, get very little secular education, teach their kids a fully Haredi lifestyle, and from a certain perspective are fine American citizens and even live largely off of welfare of the state. So you say that, like, to the Haredim, America is really, really a Medina Shel Chesed. If you think of our argument yesterday about food stamps and things like things like that, and also it's kind of a dig at someone like Rabbi Shapiro. You're saying America's a Medina Shel Chesed. If you're a rabbi, you have no excuse not to be ultra Orthodox, because all of these modern things are really leniencies in order to get ahead among the goyim. But the Haredim here have demonstrated that you don't need to take these leniencies to get ahead with the goyim. So therefore, things like shaving and various things that modern Orthodox take leniency on that most people would accept are really only leniencies to get along with the goyim. What's your excuse to continue those leniencies if we're a Medina Shel Chesed and you could just be Haredi without any pushback of the goyim?
Okay, let me play more here.
Is being kind. If you have a different conception of government, that we're all involved. This isn't a dictatorship or monarchy. This is a government of, by, and for the people. The whole concept of malchus shel chesed makes no sense. So he goes on that since it's a malchus shel chesed, therefore you have to do what you can to strengthen it. Therefore, he says you can't make any general decisions. Everything depends on the place and the time, and to choose the least worst, which a lot of people even today or tomorrow vote based upon what they think is the least worst. And he says it depends on each circumstance. He brings an example by like Yom Kippur. You feed a person non-kosher, you feed a person a little bit at a time. You don't. So he says sometimes you have to do, even if it's not what we prefer, because he doesn't believe in voting in theory, but we have to. So it's the least worst alternative. But then he says, he says if there's a person who's going to go against the Torah, you don't vote for him. You should vote for the one who's going to be more in line with the Torah. How do you determine who's more in line with Torah? Well, he says you need a chacham for that. It's because one person could be against the Torah in this way, for the Torah in the other way. We already started by Drash sees this all as irrelevant. And then he says, and he says you have to look. This person is going to violate the Rabbanan. This is going to violate the Daraisa. He says, Dover Chazeb Emes Lidoli Hador. This has to be given to the great Torah sages. They will be able to tell you. They'll be able to distinguish. And this is like in Europe. He says, in Europe, the great rabbis would determine what to do. Now, this clearly reflects a Haredi perspective that Das Torah, that the great rabbis, are the ones to make these decisions. Now, in a sense, this is all a fiction for many, because if you go to Israel, for instance, you go to completely Haredi towns, you'll find plenty of people who are not voting for Shas or Agudas Yisrael or Degod Torah or any of them. They're voting for Likud, and they're voting for every party. So many people don't take this entirely seriously, but this is a position that...
Okay, let me just talk a little bit about Das Torah. So that's a concept more in Haredi Judaism than modern Orthodox Judaism. And it says that Jews should seek the input of rabbinic scholars, not just on matters of Jewish law, but on all important life matters, on the grounds that the knowledge of the Torah aids everything in life. So you should go to your rabbi for guidance on your profession, on how you should run your business, how you should vote. And Avi Shafran, Director of Public Affairs for the American Haredi organization Agudat Yisrael, explains the concept. Das Torah is not some Jewish equivalent to the Catholic doctrine of papal infallibility. Not only can rabbis make mistakes, there is an entire tractate of the Talmud, horut, predicated on the assumption that they can, that even the Sanhedrin is capable of erring even in matters of Jewish law. What does Torah means is that those most imbued with Torah knowledge and who have internalized a large degree of the perfection of values and refinement of character that the Torah idealizes are thereby rendered particularly, indeed extraordinarily qualified to offer an authentic Jewish perspective on matters of import to Jews, just as expert doctors are those most qualified, though still fallible, to offer medical advice. Rabbi Pesach Eliyahu Falk writes that which poskim, meaning deciders of Jewish law, cannot prove from an explicit source, is decided upon by a thought process which has been tuned and refined by tens of thousands of hours of Torah study, which enables them to perceive where the pure truth lies. This process is called Das Torah, an opinion born out of Torah. Their thought process has not been affected by secular non-Jewish ways of thinking. So according to the Rambam, Maimonides, people who reach out to God, who have the most finely tuned tuner to the divine, are the most likely to interact with the divine. Dovid, any thoughts?
Yeah, that's why I like to call Rabbi Shapiro an apologist, because in my eyes, the main thing about Orthodox Judaism is largely superstition, in terms that most Orthodox Jews believe in superstition and believe that there's divine karma working, connecting the fulfillment of rituals and the listening to the sages and what happens day to day. And modern Orthodox people are substantially less likely to believe that. And, Dutton has the studies on IQ, although he disputes that, the questions of whether more high IQ people or lower IQ people are more likely to be extreme. And me and Luke have both noted that modern Orthodox Jews will tend to have a higher IQ. That could be for different reasons, but the one thing Marc Shapiro almost never talks about is kind of the elephant in the room, so to say, is these crazy superstitions and things that Jews actually believe, which is like Adam Green, where he's like, Adam Green is like, do you guys actually believe this or not? And so it's a difficult question, and that's the whole the Marc Shapiro book on Maimonides' 13 Principles. And then Doovid's a libertarian, so like I'm not like a cap on other people. So that's the problem with Dovid has with like Marc Shapiro, because at the same time he's like a cap on other people, then he's like like an anti-cap for the fringe people who are being caps on him, or however you want to phrase it. And so Dovid could have a more more stable mind, just being like libertarian. Like I'm not necessarily judging anyone.
And there was a question from the chat. Do you think that there's significant voter fraud in this election?
I mentioned it. I think the strategy for the Republicans, because fraud is a complicated word. If you mean like a legal term, in terms when you say you committed fraud and therefore could be held criminally accountable for it, versus your fraud, the whole thing was fraud. So I think Trump, in order to win, and I think his chances might be increasing for various reasons, just because but on the fraud issue, it has to be that mail-in voting in totality is declared fraudulent. And fraudulent meaning that someone lied, someone purposely filled out paperwork wrong, or that allowing it to happen in the way that it did was fraudulent in general. So for the Republican strategy, their strategy is probably to just say mail-in voting in totality is fraudulent, even without giving necessarily large amount of cases of people who actually did criminally fraudulent things. And so the Democratic strategy is just going to be they're lying. There's no proof of fraud. And so that whole thing is basically a word game. And but for the Republicans, it's important to keep that word game up, because if somehow they're able to get a case before the Supreme Court that would allow Trump to be president, and I'm not exactly sure, like Rodney would know that better than me, but if there's some way that the Supreme Court could rule that whatever voting extensions or mail-in things or whatever happened that made Biden the Electoral College winner as it appears is not the way it is, and somehow Trump is still going to be president, that narrative that it was fraud the whole time will be important. And saying, is it possible that it could ride up through the courts now? So you see that it's really in the hands of the elites at this point. So a handful of judges in a handful of states make decisions that leads to the Supreme Court in a way that what they rule allows President Trump to remain being president. And so I would say that's highly possible. And it could be that Democrats can't really do anything to stop it. And if they try to do violence in the street or protest, that it might make it more likely that the judges will rule that way. And so the narrative of what you're saying, like in the news and the academics, is Trump the whole time, literally versus figurative. That in order to win, he has to keep the narrative up that it's fraud. And so to say, me and you know what we mean when we say fraud, and we don't necessarily mean like people filling out fake ballots. We meant the mail-in thing the whole time, but because legally from the definition that's legally been declared constitutional and just, and the vast majority of U.S. citizens are on the side of that. I'm not sure if you're seeing it like that also. That makes sense to you.
I understand what you're saying. Let me just move on. Rabbi Yosef Blau of Yeshiva University has an op-ed in the Times of Israel, The Ethical Cost of Jewish Communal Support for Donald Trump. Orthodox Jews can defend their support of Trump in several ways, but they risk losing themselves if they commit to this kind of problematic personality for the long run. Do you have any thoughts on this column?
Yeah, I'm just looking, what's the long-term cost benefit, value of supporting Trump at this point? You're saying Luke Ford, you kickstarted you amplified your streaming by getting on Trump 2016. His rise was good for you in certain ways, that you rode the coattail of his rise, and it made sense to you in patterns in the direction of society. And to a lot of Orthodox Jews, I mean, maybe you for for different reasons also, that Trump's rise, as I said, seemed miraculous, especially with the conversion of his daughter and the nature that Israel is looked at as miraculous in the eyes of a lot of Jews and Christians. And, the continuing moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the full recognition. I even have that on my YouTube when Nathan Lewin, his daughter, argued that before the Supreme Court. And Trump eventually did that. But, that was a big deal. Even to, Nathan Lewin's daughter, Miriam Lewin, when she came to Jerusalem, that's what she spoke about, her case in front of the Supreme Court, where they argued for the right to have people born in Jerusalem have Jerusalem listed on their passport. And as I mentioned, with community leaders. So Marc Shapiro phrases things in a certain way where I disagree, that, like I told Luke, you could look at Haredi rabbis kind of like union bosses. They're not, necessarily like, just top-down figures that tell people to do what they do and everybody listens, but they negotiate relatively what the people want. Like, so it says, in Marc Shapiro's vision, Mitzitza Balpeh is just wrong. No, like, believing Jew actually wants to do that. But in reality, the practice is very popular. And it's not that, rabbis say you should do it and people listen. It's that the rabbis got the people what they wanted. And so in terms of politics, usually the Jewish method, especially as a Democratic bloc. So Luke, as a Republican, is representing relatively a minority of Jews. And sometimes you say, well, that's the elite minority, because usually the Republican Jews are the more wealthy, intelligent, educated amongst us. And not always, but, so a lot of times you say, I want to team up with the Republican Jews because, they're an elite. But that's obviously not the majority. The majority of Jews are Democratic, and the majority of Orthodox Jews are, in fact, Democrats and function as a bloc. And politically, that's usually our strategy, is to negotiate deals. where we find a politician and we have a certain amount of issues, and they agree to meet our expectations on those issues, and we might compromise on a few other issues, and then the rest is just kind of like general citizenry. So if you're looking at a cost benefit situation with Trump, there's a lot of cost, but there's a lot of benefit, so it's very difficult. And then the question, does it matter whether he represents our values? Like I mentioned, Lena Epstein, who ran for Congress here, is like, I am not pushing for Trump so that he will represent my values. I'm pushing for Trump, God forbid, so he will squash Iran, so he will, do for Israel whatever we want, and so on and lower our taxes. I'm not wanting Trump to represent our values. I want Trump to win for us. And so from an Orthodox perspective, there's a certain way that Trump is winning for us. And it's not, Trump is the illusionist who is just kind of like the great showman and makes it look like he's winning for people. But in a certain way, it looks like he was winning for the Jews. But at this point, it's questionable. So honestly, there's a lot of uncertainty. And even at this point,
let me jump in. So let me read a little bit from Rabbi Yosef Blau, Modern Orthodox Rabbi at Yeshiva University. President Donald Trump is a polarizing figure. Jewish voters split their votes as a result of wildly differing attitudes toward his candidacy in Israel. Polls show overwhelming support, reflecting the feeling that he was a consistent proponent of the policies of the Israeli government. Many Orthodox Jews in America agreed with this evaluation. Some Orthodox Jews supported Trump because of his approach to religion and state and his appointment of conservative judges. Many Jewish voters were disturbed by his personality. Trump openly defied accepted norms of behavior. He was crude and rude, cynically assuming that all are corrupt. He had no compunction about using his position for personal gain. Politics for Trump is a form of war where winning is all that matters. He sees life in transactional terms. He will support the policies desired by religious denominations while not conducting himself in accord with their expectations of upright behavior. Trump prides himself as a businessman who beat the system. He went bankrupt many times, yet never personally paid the price. Many of his Jewish supporters acknowledge these character faults, but they argue that the policy gains outweigh them. Yet, it is embarrassing to justify supporting a candidate because one benefits from his positions. Rather than appear uncaring, one easily resorts to explaining that these perceived character flaws are not really as serious as they seem, and they might even be virtues when viewed from a different perspective. In Israel, no one wants to be a friar, a sucker, incapable of playing the system, who instead abides by the system's rules. Someone who has successfully avoided paying taxes, has refrained from paying bills, and emerges stronger from falling businesses is seen as a winner. A significant Haredi rabbi explained Trump's crudity as normal for the rich. Perhaps you could explain Trump's behavior is that a non-Jew can do what he wishes and not worry about criticism if dishonesty is a given. Being open about dividing the world between supporters and enemies who don't deserve proper treatment, is an expression of authenticity. Knowing that Trump is vengeful, his followers have learned to accept his reality. We are witnessing post-election Trump essentially refusing to accept defeat. Any additional thoughts there, Dovid?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting in that perspective. And you can see like a certain Haredi perspective, it might not matter the values of the politicians. Like, look, the guy's a politician. I don't care about his values. Like, I expect him to be a scumbag, God forbid. Just a matter of a trade-off. And maybe a certain amount of Judaism, and especially Orthodoxy, is that, yes, that is the Jewish view. It might sound upsetting and off-putting to a lot of goyim and even to a lot of secular Jews. But that is the traditional Jewish way and the correct way to look at it, even that there's a lot of vitriol. I remember, Jake Turks, and it was saying, like, I'm tired of Jake Tapper representing Judaism. I want Jake Turks to represent Judaism. And the cynical view of maybe the combination of the alt-right and ultra-Orthodoxy behind Trump is that there's a lot of secular Jews in media. And it's like, okay, Jake Tapper and Jake Turks aren't necessarily mirror images of each other, but in another aspect, they are. And then when you want the view on Judaism, does Jake Tapper represent Judaism, or does Jake Turks represent Judaism? And if you're an Orthodox Jew for years, anytime anyone's had any question on Judaism, you're not even going to get a guy like Marc Shapiro. Like, Dovid is nitpicking and upset with the way Marc Shapiro is portraying Haredim. But, like, you know, in the news, like, we would never get a guy like, you know, we would be lucky to get Peter Beinart to be asked the questions about describing Haredi culture. And if you're in New York, basically the New York Times is considered a piece of trash, that all it does is trash Orthodox Jews, and most of the media like CNN and various things are usually very negative. Even like CNN had their thing on Believers or something where they trashed Orthodox Judaism, they trashed Hinduism and various things. So that vitriol is there, and you know, Israel's a messy place. Israel came to being on war, and Orthodox Jews are more in tune with Israel. And also in Israel, like censorship, if you think of simple things like when people get tortured and killed, you don't see it on the U.S. media. And even the pictures like of the Tree of Life massacre, you don't, like, we don't see those pictures. That's not the way we do it here in the U.S. But in Israel, that is the way we do it. If you're in Israel, you, God forbid, little kids see the pictures of dead bodies. That's you know, a different nature of that. But the Orthodox people are more real in that sense because they're more in tune with Israel, and that dynamic, you know, saying like it could keep Trump in the White House. You know, if Netanyahu is the sleazy loser politician he might be, and he's like, I'm going to go with Biden, I'm still prime minister of Israel, I used Trump up and now I'll use Biden up, you know, that might leave Israel weak, like Bennett or something, like a long shot coalition of you know, let Netanyahu choose the losing side, let Netanyahu already start working together with President-elect Biden or something like that, that a new administration that's going to replace Netanyahu teams up with Trump. And on the world stage also, you think like the media, who they're telling you is the important world leaders, are congratulating Trump. But, you know, maybe Modi and China, or these various people, like I was saying, you know, like all these Iranian or Middle Eastern countries that might do peace deals with Israel, I would not preclude crazy things happening now.
Okay, let me read from Marc Shapiro column. Rabbi Steinman and the Messiah. So after the passing of Rabbi Yosef Shalom Elyashiv, the simmering dispute in the Lithuanian world, and so the Lithuanian world does not refer to just Lithuania, refers to Jews of Lithuanian origin, broke out into the open this means really in Jerusalem and in Israel in particular. And a minority of the Lithuanian community refused to accept the leadership of Rabbi Aaron Yehuda Leib Steinman, who was backed by Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. The opponents, known as the Plague, were led by the late Rabbi Shmuel Auerbach. While people are aware of the wild behavior of the Plague youth, as they are the ones who block streets in Jerusalem, there's very little awareness of what was another element of the battle in the Lithuanian community. That was the attempt to delegitimize Rabbi Steinman. An entire literature was created that focused on two things. The first was citing all sorts of things that Rabbi Steinman said, which were believed to be in opposition to Haredi ideology. The point was to show that because of his supposedly liberal views, he was not suited to lead the Haredi world, and that he had departed from the approach of Rabbi Shach. The other focus, also found in Peleg publications, was to show that Rabbi Steinman did not have the requisite Torah scholarship to lead the community. For obvious reasons, they never made this claim about Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, never explained why they felt able to disagree with Rabbi Kanievsky, who was the most outstanding backer of Rabbi Steinman. While this dispute was playing out, Rabbi Steinman said something that was like manna from heaven for the Peleg, for they now had a chance to use some heavy ammunition on him, as they could claim that he rejected the Rambam's 12th principle, which affirms the coming of the Messiah. All right, so let me move on. So in response to the need to actively wait for the Messiah, Rabbi Steinman replies that no one fulfills this, namely, no one is really waiting for the Messiah. No one is consciously focusing on and anxiously awaiting the Messiah's arrival. In reality, they believe that the Messiah will come, but in the meantime, they are learning Torah and they are doing mitzvot, divine commandments, and when he comes, he comes. But until then, Jews have plenty to do to keep themselves busy. Rabbi Bergman is surprised by Rabbi Steinman's comment and states that the Rambam, meaning Moses Maimonides, says that if one does not wait for the Messiah, he is a heretic, to which Rabbi Steinman repeats his earlier point that nobody does this. Upon being questioned again, Rabbi Steinman replies that this is a decree that the community cannot follow. He adds that people say that the Chafetz Chaim waited for the Messiah. Maybe yes, I don't know. This is what they say, maybe yes. Rabbi Steinman then adds that the Chafetz Chaim was unique, but the Torah was not given for such special people. Rabbi Steinman's statements are quite provocative. This is Marc Shapiro writing about the controversy. First, because he expresses uncertainty if the Chafetz Chaim can really be said to have actively waited for the Messiah. Second, because he makes it clear that the other great rabbis did not really wait for the Messiah. Would have been controversial enough if all he said was that he himself or the people of this generation do not really wait for the Messiah. But he applied this statement also to the great ones of previous generations. Rabbi Bergman insisted that waiting for the Messiah is one of the 13 principles of the Jewish faith, according to Maimonides, that in earlier times people did indeed wait for the Messiah. Rabbi Steinman replies that in earlier days the Jews suffered greatly, and that is why they had a focus on the Messiah. Rabbi Yehezkel Sofer states that one is not a heretic if he is lacking an emotional connection to the coming of the Messiah. The problem is only if one develops an intellectual position that there is no reason to wait for the Messiah. Rabbi Sofer adds, however, that from a Haredi perspective, a higher level of waiting is required, which not everyone is capable of. Now, Rabbi Steinman's statement can be explained simply that despite what the Rambam says, it is difficult for virtually anyone to be emotionally invested in the coming of the Messiah and thus have a sense of waiting for him, especially waiting constantly every day, which is how the principle is formulated in this Siddur, meaning the Jewish prayer book. Rabbi Steinman was saying, what is the point of speaking about something which hardly anyone can fulfill? At the end of the day, it is enough to believe in the coming of the Messiah without adding anything else to this basic belief. Dovid, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, a little background. The Peleg, which I think means like a division or faction, but they're possibly a group of up to 60,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews, usually of Litvish extraction. Some say their origins are a little disputed if they're followers of the Vilna Gaon or the various rabbis, but they're the most extreme in protest against decrees from Israel, most specifically mandatory military service and Zionism. Those are the people that you see laying down in the street, getting arrested en masse, getting beat down by the Israeli police. And so, Marc Shapiro is biased in this as general Zionism. Marc Shapiro does not want to accept that. I mean, I don't know exactly to put thoughts or words into his mouth, but like a little bias. You could consider it kind of like, first Marc Shapiro's taking the view that people do things because of elites. It's because of Trump and Biden and Richard Spencer and various things. And if these actors just act different, the masses would act different. And Dovid doesn't see it like that. Generally, I think the things are descriptive, not prescriptive, and people get in front of crowds. The people don't, speak, and then crowds gather, and then people get in front of it, and you only stay in front of the crowd by generally giving it what it wants. And so Marc Shapiro's bias here is probably to not want to legitimize or accept that there are hundreds of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews that despise and hate the state of Israel. They think the state of Israel is more evil than Iran, even possibly more evil than Nazi Germany. So for whatever reason, Marc Shapiro and his understanding of Judaism just can't really fathom that. He can't seem to explain the fundamental issue of there being a certain amount of ultra-Orthodox Jews that never accepted Israel and from a certain extent would rather die than have to accept the state of Israel. And it's a big issue because these guys protest, these guys shut down cities, these guys get arrested, these guys lay down in front of buses, and they don't join the army, and all these various issues. But at the same time, they could sometimes be part of the ruling coalition. So from a certain point of view in Israeli politics, these guys are extremists. You could consider like Antifa or the Proud Boys, if you, because it's hard to question where you put these guys on the right or the left of whether you're going to consider Peleg like Antifa or Proud Boys, but they're like the street wing of the Haredim. So Marc Shapiro wants to say, no, they're just crazies. They don't listen to any rabbi. And a lot of people be like, yeah, those guys are doing the bidding of the rabbis. When Netanyahu and the coalition come like, you guys will do your time in the military, and the rabbis say 0% chance. We would rather die than accept that order, and then they send those guys out into the street. So Marc Shapiro's bias is pretty clear in that. So this actually what he's talking about is the leadership of an important Haredi rabbi, Rabbi STEINMAN. It's saying to your average person, they're not trying to oust this rabbi because of his beliefs on heresy, but that's just the language, meaning to say he's not extreme enough to represent the masses of Haredim, because the masses of Haredim in Israel are much more extreme than the leadership that represents them. So people like Marc Shapiro, he goes to Harvard and knows millionaires. They become buddies with the leadership and the Hasidic rebbes and the political leaders. But the masses, they're like, no, we do not want to make a deal with Israel. We want Israel to collapse. We want Israel to fall. Israel is the enemy. And that's how I'd put the issue. I'm not sure if that's how you'd see it, Luke, and you agree with me on Marc Shapiro's dissonant that he can't accept that it's anti-Zionism at the heart of this.
Yeah, I don't think that really addressed anything that Marc Shapiro was writing about. But anyway, let me read a little bit more here from Marc Shapiro. Rabbi Yehoshua Soloveitchik defended Rabbi Steinman. Thinking about the Messiah is not something that needs to be at the top of our concerns. Using Gershom Sholom's terminology, we can say that Rabbi Soloveitchik's approach is that of neutralization of the messianic impulse. Whatever you may think of Rabbi Soloveitchik's words, I don't know how to square them with what his grandfather, Rabbi Isaac Zev Soloveitchik, the Brisker Rav, is quoted as saying, that not only must we await the Messiah every day, but we must do so the entire day and every instant. A person says that he would prefer that the Messiah not come in the near future, but only in a few years, as he will by then have completed the study of the entire Talmud and will be more prepared to greet the Messiah. Nevertheless, this person knows that God does not take into account his wishes, and he still believes that the Messiah can come at any instant. And this person has not violated Maimonides' principle. So the principle requires the belief that the Messiah will come and can come at any instant, yet it does not require you to actually desire the Messiah's arrival. So to give a different example, if someone has a very good business in the diaspora, could be that while he believes in the coming of the Messiah, does not actually want this to happen because he thinks that after the Messiah's arrival, all Jews will have to move to Israel, and he does not want to give up his thriving business. So these sentiments, according to Rabbi Schulzinger, would not be in contradiction to Maimonides' principle. Okay, Dovid, any thoughts on this or any final words for today?
Yeah, and just to clarify why I was mentioning the Zionism is the greater picture that Rabbi Steinman is kind of the moderating force of Haredim, trying to convince Haredim to go more in line with the state. And that's why I'm saying that's why Marc Shapiro is trying to legitimize Rabbi Steinman and take his side. My picture, the Peleg, generally are more right-wing in general, and they don't want to be moderated and go in line with the state. And, so the scholars, when they're attacking, so we say, what about the Shas leadership? What about the political leadership? So are these protesters in Antifa or the Proud Boys, is Proud Boys doing the bidding of Trump? And so, Marc Shapiro is saying the Proud Boys are not doing the bidding of Trump, that the Peleg are not doing the bidding of the rabbis. And, like Rabbi Steinman speaks for the rabbis, and any of those people, they're just wackos. And Dovid is of the opinion that, no, those guys are actually doing the bidding of the rabbis. And Rabbi Steinman, I'm not saying he's a bad rabbi, but he's kind of been delegitimized by working too much together with the state. And this, not even like on a Rabbi Jonathan Sachs level, but this is just kind of like on a narrow perspective, Grady level. So actually, I rather enjoyed this, Luke. So I appreciate you minimizing your viewership to talk intensely Jewish sectarianism and actually Israeli politics, because I think maybe just what's going on here could enlighten people to Israeli politics also. So appreciate it.
Okay, Dovid, take care. Good to talk to you. All right, so I'm sure you, like me, when you heard voter fraud in the news, your immediate thought was, well, what the heck does the Harvard Kennedy School of Government have to say about voter fraud? And a paper that they released November 6th of 2020, Harvard says that voter fraud is a red herring. Proponents of stricter voting laws often claim restrictions are necessary to prevent voter fraud, but there is little evidence to support this assertion. President Trump has repeatedly claimed without evidence that widespread voter fraud was committed by his opponents in the 2016 election, asserting that there were 3 to 5 million illegal votes cast in the 2016 election. November 27, 2016, the president tweeted, in addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. January 25, 2017, Trump tweeted, I will be asking for a major investigation into voter fraud, including those registered to vote in 2 states, those who are illegal, and even those registered to vote who are dead, and many for a long time. Depending on results, we will strengthen up voting procedures. The White House produced no evidence to support these claims, which seem to have been intended to encourage regulation to suppress voting, not to combat fraud. Okay, so let's get a little bit here from Greg and Jared. Oh man, just as I'm pulling up the post-election roundtable, bloody quits.
I'm Greg Johnson. Welcome to Countercurrents Radio. Begin with stream.live/countercurrents without pieces recently at American Renaissance about the likely outcomes. He's also published a really fine piece by Gregory Hood, which I found rather encouraging. So I thought we would begin with Jared. Jared, what are your thoughts? I know the situation is changing rapidly, but should we despair or should we be optimistic?
We should never despair. We should never despair because we're right and they're wrong. They may be temporarily winning, but if there's any justice, truth, or beauty in the world, we will prevail in the end because we are the ones who are right, we are just, we are true, and we are beautiful. But aside from generalities of that kind, as far as the election is concerned, there's one observation I would like to make, and that is if the results had been the reverse, if after a protracted vote in which the lead seesawed back and forth, and finally by just the skin of his teeth, Donald Trump had been elected and was considered president-elect, at least by his own party, there would be an enormous amount of rioting. I'm quite convinced of that. And it's under those circumstances that those states that called in the National Guard and those cities and stores boarded up all their stores in New York City, Washington, D.C. now, there's hardly a plate glass window downtown anywhere. They would have all been justified in doing that. But because Trump supporters and in general white people don't riot, this outcome of the election has been, so far as I can tell, almost entirely peaceful. In fact, on election night, before there were any results in Washington, D.C., there were about 150 black-clad people, and we know that they would not be Trump supporters. They were walking around saying, burn down the electorate, and they were proposing all sorts of impossible physical gyrations of a sexual nature to both candidates. This kind of utter anarchy and hatred for the system, that's not something you find in Trump supporters. So that's the one observation that I would like to make at the outset, that we would be rioting, or the country would be rioting, if the outcome had been reversed.
Well, given that's the case, and given that Republicans tend to be law-abiding, sensitive people who think ahead, worry about the future, worry about their own personal safety, the very fact that there's been so much unrest and unrestrained violence going on in major cities, surely that has had some kind of depressing effect, I would think, on the Republican electorate. How legitimate is this outcome, given that kind of atmosphere of violence? And also the fact that Joe Biden, in so many words, basically threatened more violence if Donald Trump got reelected.
I think it can work both ways. If the voters were convinced that somehow by stepping in and controlling the violence, a rejuvenated Donald Trump would save them, then they might have been encouraged to vote for him. On the other hand, if we have a vigorous law and order president, look what he's done. He's accomplished essentially nothing in terms of stopping the rioting, stopping the violence. So it seems to me it can work both ways. There was a remarkable article in Atlantic, maybe a month before the election, in which this author, he's got an Indian name, unfortunately I can't remember the name, he said that if Republicans really do believe in law and order, they'd better vote for Joe Biden because with Joe Biden in the White House, all the rowdies out there and the anarchists are much more likely to tame themselves. We won't find this kind of rampant violence. Now, this struck me as obviously a kind of a shakedown. It's a protection racket. It's like the mafia going to the local grocery store and saying, well, there are going to be very bad things if you don't pay us $500 a month to protect you. It was really an appalling thing to me, but there may be some truth in that. It may be that people who really are just disgusted by the sight of police cars going up in flames, they may have thought that this might come to an end if there is a change in the White House. But I can't be sure about that. On the question of whether or not Trump supporters should be rioting or should be making a huge fuss over this possibility that the election was stolen, I really don't have any opinion on that question. If, as Donald Trump has promised, he's going to do lawsuits and there are going to be recounts, then the truth of this stuff will, I presume, come forward. We will.
And back to the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, their paper released November 6. Claims of widespread voter fraud have been made without evidence by other Republican officials. Chris Kobach, former Secretary of State of Kansas, has been outspoken campaigner against voter fraud. For example, claiming without evidence that fraudulent votes tipped the election in Minnesota for former Senator Al Franken. 2005, the United States Senate Republican Policy Committee stated in a report that voter fraud continues to plague our nation's federal elections, diluting and canceling out the lawful votes of the vast majority of Americans. The report contained no credible evidence to back up the claim. Since 2018, there have continued to be multiple accusations of election fraud, again presented without evidence. In the 2018 elections, there are allegations of fraud in Florida and Arizona made by Republican politicians. Florida's Senate race, Republican Rick Scott filed a lawsuit alleging rampant fraud in the counties that heavily favored Democrats because the counties took longer to tally the votes. The lawsuit led to a Broward County Circuit judge ordering the Broward County Supervisor of Elections to release records requested by Scott and the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee relating to voting tabulations. The records released did not include any evidence to support the accusations of fraud. And the Florida Department of State, which oversees elections, did not receive or observe any credible evidence of fraud or criminal activity. In Arizona's 2018 Senate race, the Arizona Republican Party accused the Maricopa County recorder of premeditated destruction of evidence after voting irregularities in the election. However, no evidence of voter fraud was produced, and the Republican Martha McSally conceded the race to Democrat Kristen Sinema. Good old Kristen Sinema. What a senator she is. So apparently Minneapolis police have a bit of a staffing shortage. In Kentucky, Governor Matt Bevin claimed that there are a number of significant irregularities and thousands of absentee ballots that were illegally counted in the November 2019 gubernatorial election. No evidence was produced to back up this claim, and Bevin eventually conceded the race after losing a recount. Bipartisan studies have concluded that there has been little evidence of widespread voter fraud in modern American elections. The Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank, has compiled a nationwide database of charges of voter fraud over 37 years from 1982 to 2019. During this period, 1,085 charges resulted in criminal convictions, an average of just 29 convictions nationally per year. 2017 national voting study by the Brennan Center for Justice, an academic policy center and think tank, concluded very few non-citizens voted in the 2016 election. Across 42 jurisdictions studied, election officials who oversaw the tabulation of 23.5 million votes referred only an estimated 30 incidents of suspected non-citizen voting for further investigation or prosecution. So improper non-citizen votes accounted for 0.0001% of the 2016 votes in these jurisdictions. 40 of the jurisdictions, all but 2 of the 42 studied, reported no known incidents of non-citizens voting in 2016. In the 10 counties with the largest populations of non-citizens in 2016, only 1 reported any instances of non-citizens voting consisting of fewer than 10 votes. In California, Virginia, and New Hampshire, the states where President Trump claimed the problem of non-citizen voting was especially acute, no official identified an incident of non-citizen voting in 2016. In 2002, the Justice Department established the Ballot Access and Voting Integrity Initiative to prosecute voter fraud. From 2002 to 2006, just 86 people across the country were convicted of ballot fraud offenses. Voter fraud convictions were an infinitesimal part of the overall vote, more than 110 million votes cast nationwide. So until now, there's been virtually no evidence of widespread voter fraud. There have been only a tiny number of convictions for voter fraud. So maybe this time round it will be different. Okay, guys, do you know that there's an enormous amount of disinformation that is flowing out there due to live streams? Live streams. There's probably a live stream going on around you right now that's trafficking in disinformation. There are probably people at your workplace who, within the past week, have watched a live stream that contains disinformation. There are live streaming disinformation merchants who are targeting your children. Do you even know if your children are watching live stream disinformation streams? How do you know that your children's minds have not been warped by live streamers trafficking in disinformation? Often these disinformation merchants, they give out their first bits of disinformation for free just to try to get you hooked on disinformation. Disinformation is flowing like a sewer throughout society due to live streams on YouTube and on Twitter, Periscope, and on Facebook. It's a veritable sewer out there. It's a sewer of disinformation. And it is flooding. It is flowing. It is penetrating. It is pounding. It is breaking down. It is gumming up our fragile democracy. There's disinformation all around, and it's flowing through YouTube live streams. It's really serious, guys.
Tech platforms took their most aggressive stance against election misinformation last week, flagging tweets and putting warning labels on questionable allegations. And yet false claims and conspiracy theories still reached a lot of people. One reason? Live video. NPR tech correspondent Shannon Bond joins us now to explain. Hi, Shannon.
Hey, Ari.
Start off by telling us about some of these live videos that have popped up since last week. Like, what do you see in them?
Well, how much time do you have? So let's start with Election Day. There were fake results that were live streamed on YouTube, which is the video platform owned by Google. And one of these live streams actually reached the top 5 on Google's results for vote tallies in swing states. And, that meant that hundreds of thousands of viewers saw some of these streams before YouTube eventually took them down. We also are seeing live commentary from influencers, sort of like what you would see on cable news, right? And so these influencers will push these false narratives about voter fraud. They'll show tweets, they'll play other video clips, and they often frame them as saying, well, I'm just asking questions, or people on the internet are saying this. Another tactic we see is what is effectively fake live video. So people post video from something that happened last year, or take a video from a protest in one city and claim it's live from another city, and they'll use trending hashtags on those videos to reach a lot of people.
I think we're all familiar now with how social media companies can crack down on text and photos that stay up for a while and you pull them down. How do you do that with live video? I mean, it seems like a unique challenge.
Yeah, we did see these companies move really quickly last week, labeling posts from President Trump and his supporters making false claims. But live video is harder to stop the spread of. For one reason, it's live, and you can't scan it as quickly as text. Here's what Evelyn Dueck told me. She's at Harvard Law School. She studies the platform's rules.
It's harder to search video content as opposed to text. And so it's a lot harder to scrutinize what's going on, and it's a lot more time consuming.
And so these videos, they may eventually get taken down by the platforms, or a label is put on saying they're misleading. But in the meantime, they reach lots and lots of viewers.
What do the companies say they're doing about this?
Well, we should say, first of all, that Google, Facebook, and TikTok are all among NPR's financial supporters. Now, Facebook and YouTube both say they are taking steps to limit the reach of misleading claims made on live video, by limiting distribution or not recommending them. But they're still slow at this. Take last week, former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon went on a live stream on Facebook and YouTube, and he called for Dr. Anthony Fauci and FBI Director Christopher Wray to be beheaded. YouTube and Facebook both deleted this video, but only hours after it had gone live, had lots and lots of people had seen it. The companies also penalized Bannon's account. He can't post new posts or new videos. But that was a less aggressive stance than Twitter, which permanently suspended Bannon's account. And another tricky challenge for these platforms is, a video doesn't just stay on one platform. So in many cases, somebody will take a snippet of a live feed from YouTube, right, with baseless rumors and spreading these sort of claims. They'll put that up on TikTok. Maybe TikTok takes it down because it also doesn't allow some of these misleading claims. But those things get reposted, and it's just really hard to stamp out. It's so hard for any individual company to take really effective action kind of against the proliferation of these false claims, because even after they've been debunked, they pop up again and again.
That's NPR tech correspondent Shannon Bond. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Wow. That is so scary. I think there's all this disinformation that's just flowing.
And now more from NPR.
Just flowing
Live from
society.
NPR News, I'm Jack Speer. President
Thanks, Jack.
Donald Trump commemorated Veterans Day.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks a lot. Appreciate you stopping by. Thank you for your contributions. Okay, so many of you kind of curious, how does one dress like 1896? Any of you would like to dress like 1896? So here's the video. Here's the dress like 1896. And here's Jared Taylor, who was born 50 years before 1896.
Find out what happened and what did not happen.
Do you think it's plausible that there has been fraud?
I think anything is possible. It is certainly true that the Democrats so despise, fear, and hate Donald Trump that if they could get away with it, I think many of them would just cook the books to the extent possible. But there are a lot of safeguards in place. It's a serious federal crime to get involved in election fraud of some kind. I just don't know. It's something about which I would just be speculating. I have no inside information. And I'm hoping, perhaps this is the Pangloss in me, but I'm hoping that at least in the recounts and in whatever lawsuits are filed, the truth of the matter will come to light.
So what do you think is likely for us, our movement, and just race-conscious white people in general, if it's widely perceived that this is a stolen election, a corrupt election, but Biden ends up taking the White House? What do you think is going to happen for us?
I don't think very much will happen. If, in effect, all the organs of state agree that this was a legitimately won election, if there are no lawsuits or recounts that bring to light massive fraud, then life will go on. Many people, many millions of people perhaps will think that this was an illegitimate election. But what are they going to do about it? They're going to try to launch a military coup. They're going to be in the streets with their pitchforks. None of that's going to happen. None of that's going to happen. So I suspect we're going to have a Biden-Harris presidency, and we will just have to get used to it. Now, would this presidency be any different if Biden and Harris had won legitimately and by a landslide? That would mean, I think, that they would feel bolder in doing the things that they wish to do. But I don't think that it would make our life any different. They're going to be in the White House. I fear that is the case. And we have to accommodate ourselves to that, whether the election was stolen or not. Now, what will happen to racially conscious white people in a Biden-Harris administration, I think was very clearly illustrated in that little video that Kamala Harris put out. In no more than 40 seconds, she, I thought, quite adroitly explained the difference between what she calls equality and equity. She says equality, it's all very well to give people the same opportunities, but we want people to finish at the same place on the finish line. Everybody should end up at the same place. And she says that's equity. And she and Uncle Joe are going to move mountains in order to achieve equity. And in this case, she's clearly talking about racial equity, equal outcomes, not just equal opportunity. And as you will recall, Joe Biden himself promised to root out systemic racism. Now, I looked up this question of systemic racism, and you can look these Google trends that indicate how frequently a word has occurred over the last months and years, and even you can go back 10 years or more. Do you know when the term systemic racism first emerged from essentially zero?
No, when?
It's the week after George Floyd died in Minneapolis. There is this enormous spike. It's as if those words did not exist before then. And so, in effect, we have Joe Biden promising to root out something that most Americans had never heard of, was only discovered in May, just a few months ago. But of course, today, systemic racism. I mean, they keep changing their terms. It's the latest excuse for why blacks and Hispanics fail and why we must be blamed for it. The new word now is systemic racism. People talk about discrimination. People talk about segregation, the legacy of lynching, the legacy of slavery, institutional racism. They have to come up with term after term, concept after concept, because they can't find enough wicked, living, breathing white people who are putting guns to black people's heads or forcing young black women to become pregnant against their will. None of this is out there. So you have to find some sort of excuse for black and also Hispanic failure. And that's the new one. But And I thought it was very significant in this video. The way the situation is made equitable is that the level of the earth rises. It rises up. And the poor black guy who's been crouched below, unable to make it to the top, the earth rises, and then he can make it to the top. So they're going to have to move the level of the earth if they think they're going to get rid of this will-o'-the-wisp of systemic racism.
Yeah, I wish we could simply have a national conversation about alternative explanations for unequal outcomes. You think that if something is that important, that we should actually be able to talk about it?
I've spent 30 years trying to talk about this. And of course, the whole question of racial differences in IQ, it's a disagreeable one. No one wants to go up to black people, in effect, and say, well, sorry, on average, you folks are just not as bright as we are, but take consolation. We are not, on average, as bright as these East Asians. It's not a question of nothing but equal groups. No one wants to have that conversation, as you say, but whites, out of pure self-defense, have to make this point. Because if we remain silent, if we accept the idea that every difference in outcome is due to our wickedness, then there's no way out, absolutely no way out. And we will go through one program after another that effectively penalizes us. It's our fault. We have to pay. There was a remarkable article in the Journal of Higher Education talking about the barriers faced by blacks. And they found this black lady professor at one of the southern universities. And she said, it's not our responsibility to come up with ways to fix this mess. You white people, you're smart folks. You got black people into this terrible dilemma. It's your job to figure out ways to help. In other words, we black people don't even have to lift a finger. We don't have to move a muscle. It's your problem, your fault, your responsibility. Dig us out of this hole. I suspect that's an increasingly widespread view.
Yeah, that is quite remarkable. It seems like a lot is depending on whether or not the Democrats will gain control of the Senate, and there are a couple of seats that are going to be decided. I believe it's on January 5th in Georgia. If Biden-Harris comes in with a divided Congress, that I think would put a limit on the kinds of radical things that they feel like they can push through.
Well, they still have quite a considerable margin for maneuver strictly by executive order. Yeah, and Joe Biden has already promised, and he has the power to do this. He's going to reverse the cuts in refugee admissions that Donald Trump had achieved. Donald Trump had cut it from about 125,000 a year to 25,000 a year. Hillary Clinton was promising 250,000. Who knows? The sky's the limit for Uncle Joe. I think he'll be happy to let in practically anybody who wants to come. Also, he has promised immediately to get rid of, by executive order, the remnants of the Muslim travel ban that Donald Trump had managed. He had managed to salvage a bit of that through the courts. That's all going to disappear. And I have no doubt that he will end the prohibition of the use of critical race theory in government institutions. Also, and this is something that we have to thank for Jeff Sessions and his legacy, there's been a considerable move in making sure that people who are likely to become public charges do not get green cards, do not become permanent citizens of the United States. To me, the idea that somebody's going to go on the dole, or in effect is going to be a public charge, should then be welcomed to the United States and live at taxpayer largesse. This to me is something that I would think that Democrats should oppose just as much as Republicans. But let us not forget, when Joe Biden, president-elect, alas, I think we have to call him president-elect, was on the stage in the primaries with 9 other candidates, and they were all asked, would you give free medical care to illegal immigrants? Every last one of them raised his hand. And to me, this is a colossal act of foolishness that even many Democrats would oppose. If I had been Donald Trump in this campaign, I would have repeated that scene over and over and over in my campaign ads, but apparently no one seems to have thought of it.
So how do you rate the Trump re-election campaign?
Well, Trump, in his debates with Joe Biden, the things that he critiqued Joe Biden most vociferously for were the things that were the best things he ever did. This 3 strikes and you're out stuff, firmer, longer sentences for criminals. This is something he kept harping on. He was trying to make himself sound more like a Democrat. I think that Donald Trump, one thing that he could have done it on either of those debates, or he could have held a press conference to do this at any point since the death of George Floyd. He should have very carefully and briefly and concisely laid out the statistics on crime that completely explode the idea that the police are running around with this malevolent attitude towards blacks, looking for any opportunity to find an innocent black, shoot him to death, arrest him, et cetera, et cetera. You can show with statistics in a way that is not all that difficult to understand. And Heather McDonald does a great job, by the way. I've seen paid advertisements on YouTube, for example, of her in just maybe 2 or 3 minutes, explaining why, given the crime rates, given the way that the blacks are killing police officers and killing each other, their involvement in violent crime, resistance to arrest, that the rate at which they actually die at the hands of the police, which is very, very low, by the way, is considerably lower than one would expect, given the kind of criminal behavior they engage in and given the kind of violence that the police face at their hands. I would love Donald Trump to have done it. Why didn't he do something as obvious as that? Why not? To me, that's a mystery. Surely there are people within the White House. I mean, we're told over and over that Stephen Miller is a secret white supremacist. I'm sure there are others who actually know what the crime statistics are. He never said this. But so we continue barreling down this completely futile and ultimately destructive direction of thinking that somehow the criminal justice system and the police and American society is just bound and determined to make life as difficult, as violent, and as excruciating as possible for black people, whereas there is no evidence for this. None. Zero. That is the great pity and tragedy of all of these well-meaning white people who think they're being so good and so virtuous by mouthing idiotic slogans like white silence is violence.
Yeah. One thing that strikes me about Trump and that strikes me about his reelection campaign is how scrupulously they towed this line, this census in society today, that nothing is worse than racism if it's practiced by white people.
That's right.
Minority racism is fine. That will be pandered to and encouraged. But if it's practiced by white people, that's the worst possible thing and utterly damning to your reputation in the mainstream. And therefore, Republicans who are constantly being abused, basically, with false charges, baseless charges of racism from the left, are just cringingly, reflexively trying to signal their virtue, their anti-racist bona fides. And my great fear, based on the results of the election, is that strategy is going to be reinforced. The fact of the matter is that I do think Trump should be the winner. I'm sure there's a lot of malarkey and shenanigans going on in vote counting.
Come on,
Trump
man.
Managed to pick up lots of votes from non-whites, women, etc., signaling very, very hard his anti-racist bona fides. And I'm just afraid that if Trump wins as a standard Republican, that's just going to encourage more of this foolishness from the Republican Party down the line.
It seems to be the Republicans are just incorrigible on this score. I find none of them really able to mount a sensible argument that has anything to do with race. We all concede, Republicans, I don't know why I'm using the first person plural, Republicans invariably concede that, well, yes, racism is a horrible thing, America is full of racism, and so they've already conceded the fundamental ground. They are already arguing on the opposition's turf. So, but win or lose, whether Trump ends up staying in the White House or leaving, this idea that America is a country that is seething with racism, that whether or not white people consciously are discriminating against non-whites, somehow they emit this miasma of hatred and privilege and all of this systemic this, that, and the other. It's as if we have magical power. And so much by breathing the air, white people are turning the United States into this absolute hell on earth for non-whites. This idea, it seems to be very deeply rooted, not just amongst the Democrats, but as you say, among Republicans as well. And I see no really powerful public voices arising to argue against this. And you see old magazines like, if we talk about going beyond our racially conscious publications and podcasts, if you go beyond that, you can find some of that in Quillette, for example. That's a new publication. They do some sensible things. You can find it in Heather McDonald at the Manhattan Institute. Occasionally, I mean, I hate to say it, a National Review will say a few sensible things on this, but these are minor voices. The media, the universities, the churches, they're all dominated by this idea that white people, even if they don't intend to be racist, are incorrigibly racist. And I don't see an easy way out of that, and I don't see any way out of it until, as you point out, we are allowed to discuss alternative explanations for non-white faith.
Yeah, exactly. I want to bring in a couple more of our guests. I know you have to leave relatively soon, Jared, so I wanted you to have an uninterrupted say for a while. But we've got Marc Weber and Sam Dixon. They've been listening in, and I'd like to bring them on, and maybe we can discuss some of these issues together. Specifically, I'd love to talk about how can we break down this false moral consensus that is such a massive inhibition on talking frankly about race, and also resisting these aggressive charges against white people. So let me just bring those fellows in. Sam, welcome to the stream. Good. Hello. And Marc. So I don't want to spend too much time on introductions because, well, it's kind of awkward. But Marc Weber, of course, runs the Institute for Historical Review. I've known him for close to 20 years. He's one of our most eloquent voices. He's been a guest of mine a number of times. And Sam Dixon, again, I've known you more than 20 years now. Lawyer, speaker, writer, organizer, white community organizer who has many wise things to say. So welcome both to the show. I guess I really want to pose the question, how can we fight this fake morality that racism is the worst possible thing in the world, but only practiced by white people? I mean, what are some ways that we can blast this dumb idea that's holding us back?
Well, I think we can use, what's it, cognitive dissonance? The dishonesty of these claims is very, very apparent. People hold them only because of feelings, not because of facts. And it's often difficult to get them to change their opinions because they're so committed to wanting to feel morally superior and feeling that they're part of the ruling class, the deciding class, because they listen to Nina Totenberg on National Public Radio and read the New York Times. But the most glaring example is the insistence of the system that Jews are entitled to an ethno-state in the Middle East. And if you're opposed to Israel, you're anti-Semitic. And then they do the schizophrenic 180-degree turn. And if you're a white person, a white Christian European, and you want a nation predominantly populated by your own people, in other words, an ethno-state of your own, then you're a racist. The dishonesty of this, the predatory nature of a system that adheres so fanatically to each of these totally contradictory principles. It's one way. You can point out things like that. But I'm pessimistic that the average person can ever be reached. My impression from talking to psychiatrists, as I said before, is that 70 to 80% of all people obey the authorities and believe what they're told to believe. And it takes a long time for an establishment to discredit itself in such a way that people no longer believe it. But I think we're making progress toward that day. The fact that almost half the people in America did not obey their priests, their college sociology professors, the newspapers, the ACT persons, and all these other people is very encouraging. I'm not at all discouraged by the election. I'm surprised that Trump got such a big vote. And that's kind of an indication that the effectiveness of this racist charge is wearing off.
Well, he got more votes this time than he did last time.
Yeah,
he got the second highest vote total ever after Joe Biden, unfortunately.
Well, that's, of course, because the turnout was so much greater, which to me is a good thing, too. They say the turnout was greater than any time in the last 100 years.
110% in some places.
I think that it's because it's in the last 100 years, the country's never been so divided. And this will be my last observation before I leave the floor to my elders and betters. But as far as the vote is concerned, yes, there were 71 million people who voted for the guy that for the last 4 years we've been told is a white supremacist, an anti-Semite, a racist, a homophobe, every possible bad thing. 71 million people said, no, I don't care what you say. And even there were publications that never endorsed candidates, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, Scientific American. These are magazines that are supposed to stay out of politics. They told people to vote Joe Biden. And there was just such a lopsided endorsement of Joe Biden as opposed to Donald Trump. So I agree with Sam Dixon. It's very encouraging that in the privacy of the voting booth, whether or not they are prepared to honestly express their views to a pollster, many, many Americans, in fact, we have an exact number, 71 million, said, get lost. I don't like this Biden guy. I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. That means something. There's a lot of hope there, no matter what else happens. So,
yeah, I would agree. I think that one thing that we have to understand, too, is that 71 million people did not necessarily vote for Donald Trump because they like him. A significant number of those people voted for him because they simply do not trust the entire academic, media, political, business establishment that was saying that he's a horrible guy, a threat to world peace, et cetera, and that this Biden guy should be president. It's really a repudiation of the whole dominant system. And that's kind of remarkable, I think. It's very encouraging.
I agree. Well, Greg Johnson, thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm sure you'll have a wonderful conversation with these distinguished guests that remain. And so it's been a great pleasure to be on your show again. I wish you every success in all your undertakings. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jared. All right. So, Sam, Mark?
Mr. Taylor, Jared Taylor was citing a statement by Kamala Harris about the importance of pushing not just for equality of opportunity, but equity. That is, eliminating the gap, the disparity in wealth, income levels, neighborhood crime rates, educational achievement, and so forth between whites and blacks. And Jared Taylor cited this as if this is a kind of startling thing. Of course, it is startling in the sense that it's bizarre or strange in a way, but it should be emphasized that this call for equality of results, this demand for equity, this insistence that this disparity between whites and blacks be eliminated is nothing new. It's been in place for 50, 60 years. And it's a goal, a view that not merely Democrats like Kamala Harris have been pushing, but Republicans have been pushing. It was already in 1968, in the aftermath of the riots of 1967, that the Blue Ribbon Kerner Commission report, issued by a Blue Ribbon panel set up by President Johnson, made the point that the riots were an inevitable result of the disparity of income and
particularly in Hasidic circles, even if they don't publicly declare, like this year they came out pretty publicly, but it always was apparent who the great rabbi supported, and that's why politicians go to meet with these Hasidic rabbis, because they can, if the Rabbi Meischel says who to vote for, no one's going to listen. But if the Hasidic rabbi says who to vote for, he can pull many votes. He can pull 10,000 votes if you're more, even if you're Satmar, but all the Hasidic groups have great influence. Look, it's a very illiberal position, and it's hard to imagine anyone listening to these classes could ever adopt such a position that your vote's going to be determined by what a rabbi says. In fact, I'm very good friends with someone from Lakewood, and he actually is a big Biden supporter, which is unusual because most people in Lakewood, it's probably going to be 85% Trump. But I said to him, you know, Shmuel Kamenetsky gave his Das Torah that you have to go for Trump. So he says, is this the first time you're holding by Shmuel's Das Torah? So, of course, they can only give this Das Torah as an individual private citizen, not as a member of the Moetzes Gedolah Torah of the Aguda, because it's, I assume Aguda is a nonprofit, right? As a nonprofit, you can't endorse. But that's what he says, and he says you have to vote because if you don't, maybe someone worse will come in. And he cites a proof from a Gemara that in where is it, in Sota, that in the days of the Romans, the Jews had to send a sacrifice to be offered on their festival. So they paid money that they could send it the day before. So the sacrifice was still offered, but it wasn't on the festival. And then they were able to arrange that they'd send it. It's no longer alive. It's already slaughtered. So the result, what the Gemara is showing you, is that sometimes you're in a difficult situation. You try to lessen the severity of any infraction. And that's his point here, that really we would not want to be in this situation, but under circumstances, we have to vote for all sorts of reasons. Therefore, it should be for the person who's going to be more in line with Torah. And how to determine that, you have to ask the rabbis. I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds for many, because I think many people also are going to vote and they're saying, what's in line with ethical values? Isn't that Torah values? That's not so. So Rabbi Klein, he's not just thinking the way you might be thinking in terms of broader ethical things. He's looking more in technical halachic things, will he permit abortion, etc. But the idea that you have to be guided by moral, ethical values, that's no different than saying you have to be guided by Torah perspectives. And perhaps that position is closer to what Menashe Klein is saying than the position that you don't need to be concerned about these things at all. So that's his position. This Rabbi Aryeh Clapper from outside of Boston, from Sharon, he has an institute every summer, base measures for very talented college students, where they come and now they did it by Zoom this year, but they would come for a couple of weeks and they focus on Jewish law and philosophy, how it deals with issues of the day. This year he dealt with ideas of citizenship, as reflected in rabbinic sources, and he actually studied this tshuva as one of the things. He told me they studied it as one of the approaches to how to deal with citizenship. Obviously, when you look at, say, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and the German Gedolim, how they view what it means to be a citizen, it's very different than someone who comes from Hungary, and Jews were never really welcome, never part of society in that way. But that's the tshuva. This is followed, and this is a completely separate tshuva, the next one, but this is also, to me, 1988. And I turned to Rav Menashe Klein because I found two interesting passages, and I wanted to hear his opinion on them, his perspective. In Rav Meir Don Plotsky.
So Rich Barris, the People's Pundit, he was suspended on Twitter less than an hour ago.
Piece. Meir Don Plotsky, the author of the Klei Chemda, a very interesting parish on Chumash.
This is Professor Marc Shapiro here.
There was the one before I found in one of his works. He describes how when he came to New York, he gave a shiur at Yeshivas Rebbe Yitzchak Chanan. But Rav Meir Don Plotsky is regarded as one of the great Polish Gedolim. He, along with one or two others, but he in particular was one of the people who exposed the Yerushalmi Kudshim, the Yerushalmi on the order of Kudshim, as a forgery. He even wrote a whole book on this. So, and in rabbinic circles, he just referred to him as Rav Meir Don, Meir Don Plotsky. So he says at the end of Mishpatim, the first section, he's speaking about going to the idea of secular courts, Jewish courts. He then has in brackets, he says that none of this makes a difference according to law, because everything I said that you're not supposed to go to the courts of the land, that you have to go to Beis Din, only applies to the Shoftim, doesn't apply to the Shoftim B'Zmanenu. It doesn't apply to the courts in Poland that we have, and they're not Arkos. And you have to regard them as it's Dina de Machus Adina. But I'm referring, when I speak about not going to the courts, the secular courts, Medinos Rechoko.
So Dina Machus Hadina, that refers to the law of the land is law for the Jew. So if a Jew lives in America, Jewish law and Judaism requires him to obey Jewish law.
So those far away
American law,
states, countries
well as
like
Jewish.
China and Japan, because there they worship idols. And now this is a common thing that at the beginning of books, they always say, anytime I make a negative comment about the nations among who we live, it's not referring to the nation, the Christian world. It's only referring to those pagans out in India or China or Japan. After the ones who were not anti-Semitic. That's the. So I asked Rabbi Klein, even I knew he would say about, but I wanted to hear him say it. The next one's not so clear. I said, well, what do you make of this? How could Meir Don say that there's no inyan of going to the secular courts? It's incredible because when you look around today, when Hasidic Rebbes and others have a machokes, they have to take it to the secular court. Can you imagine a bigger Chil Hashem than when Hasidic Rebbes are fighting over who should be the Yerusha? They go to the secular court, so they claim that they can't find a Beis Din that's going to be impartial, which. If they just go to the RCA Beis Din, the RCA Beis Din is impartial, obviously, but they won't go that because that's obviously the RCA Beis Din. Also, there's Zionists and things like that. So they have to go to Hasidic Beis Din, and maybe they're right. Any Hasidic Beis Din they're going to go to is going to have a connection to one of them, and but God forbid they go to outside their Hasidic world. So instead, they go to the secular courts. In fact, I think it was the Baba verse when they were at the secular court, the judge said you should not be here. You should be a Beis Din. So I mean that's an unbelievable Chil Hashem. But and how can you blame the people for going to court when the rabbis are doing it? So Rabbi Menashe says that this is only written because of the fear of the non-Jews. Just like always at the beginning of the book, you'd say anytime it says goy, it's referring to the ones in the earlier years, not the ones among who we live, and that's because of the censor, and that's true. There's no question that he is right about this. When they were speaking about, for example, the status of Christianity, sometimes they'll refer to it as they'll speak about the speaking code, and they'll speak about different halachot, which they didn't want to speak publicly about because it create enmity. Menashe is absolutely right about that. But then I sent him another passage, and that's the famous Aruch HaShulchan. That if you were in my classes on the Aruch HaShulchan, we discussed this at length, where the Aruch HaShulchan in Siman Shin Pei Chet speaks about, he's not referring to Archos, judging, he's referring to Masira. That is, can you inform? And Masira is in the news also, because what happens if some guys, they come in your show and they're not wearing masks? The Vizhnitzer Rebbe just said that if you inform on a synagogue, that let's say they're letting people in without masks, you're a Moser. And it's the worst thing in the world, being a Moser. So that's like a terrible thing. And throughout history, Jews have never wanted to turn in other Jews to the non-Jewish government. The Aruch HaShulchan says, however, that only applied in an era when the governments were not really led by any sorts of justice. It was just it was corrupt. But for when you deal with just, and he says like today in certain African countries where you just have to pay people off, but he says not true when it comes to the European countries, and in particular Adonenu Hazar Russia, our master, the Tsar, and his forefathers, and then he says Machle Britannia and England, that England spreads out its government to all the lands all over, and they protect people, and rich people don't need to hide themselves because they're protected, and therefore he says all the whole din of Masira doesn't apply in those places. Whereas when there's no valid government, if you're Moser on someone, that he could lose all his money, he could lose his life. What to do about this? Well, first let me say that this Aruch HaShulchan is not clear at all. You can always dismiss this Aruch HaShulchan as for the censor, but and there have been many, and I'm not sure what's correct. This was a big dispute because there was this guy from France who killed, he killed someone, and then he escaped to Israel, and he was arrested, and France asked for an extradition, and Israel went to the Supreme Court, and Justice Menachem Elon, who was also a big Talmud Chacham, he wrote a long decision, which is really a responsum, and he cited, among others, the Aruch HaShulchan to say that there's no problem handing over a criminal to France, even from a pure halachic standpoint, because he'll be judged. It's a civilized society. Rav Shaul Yisraeli wrote in response that he's being naive, Menachem Elon, this is what the Aruch HaShulchan means. Aruch HaShulchan is just speaking to the censor. However, the Tzitz Eliezer takes the Aruch HaShulchan seriously. I assume the Tzitz Eliezer's point is that what do you need he wouldn't have to mention England. Fine, maybe the Tsar is for the censor, but when he refers to England, he doesn't have to mention England. He's speaking really about the situation where you have a government that's going to judge someone properly. And this is really, I don't need to get into it now. You can go back online to the Aruch HaShulchan classes, but this becomes a dispute between the more modern Orthodox rabbis and the more in the Haredi world in terms of Masira. You can hear, I think Rav Shechter's also even said it, that there's no Masira in America, and others have pointed out, this isn't Masira. The whole idea of Masira assumes that it's us versus them, that, the Duke or the Prince or the King, whatever, he's taking all our money. And therefore, if I inform on someone, I'm causing the money to be stolen. But we don't have that. It's the government of the people. If someone is stealing or doing something wrong, he's also stealing from me. And we're in a different type of system. So and this came into play during the sexual abuse. People said you can't turn them in because it's Masira. And I mean, it's basically a dispute. And we're going to see later what Rabbi Greenblatt and Moshe Malka say. But I don't want to get into that as much because that's not the issue today. Just to let you know that this Aruch HaShulchan, there's a long history of how to relate to this Aruch HaShulchan. But Rabbi Klein says, Chas v'sholom. God forbid, even assume for a moment that the Aruch HaShulchan thought that there's no din of Masira in England. And he goes off, he talks about how we see today, people are taking others to secular courts, and even though it's a Malchus Shel Chesed, it causes them all sorts of problems, and he cites a Gemara to support that you can't, even if it's at least in those days, a decent Malchus Shel Chesed, you still can't be a Moser. Okay, this is really an ideological perspective, not so much halachic, because if you view modern governments the way at least the Aruch HaShulchan describes it, leaving aside whether he really meant it, then it's not Masira. It's the government is going to take care of enforcing the law, which you can't enforce the law. This whole Masira thing with the sexual abuse is always I always found it very strange. They say that someone is sexually abused, so you can't call the government because it's Masira. You got to go to the rabbis. So what does that mean? So if someone breaks in my house, he's going to rob me. I have to call the rabbi and ask, can I report him? If he raped my wife, I need to go to the rabbis and ask her. They never would say that. But with the kids, for some reason, there was such a blind spot. Then all of a sudden, it's Masira. It's if someone comes in and shoots my family up, I have to go to the rabbi before I go to the government because it's Masira. Based on that logic, of course you do. But that no one has that. It makes no sense. And no one in history has ever said that if someone comes and shoots, and comes into my house and threatens my family and kills my brother or something, I need to go to the rabbi to say, can I go to the report him? I shouldn't say no one said. We do have cases years ago where the rabbi said even murder, we'll handle it in our own community. But they handled it. But today, the rabbis have no authority. So, but that's what he holds. You get a good reflection here of a posek from a very closed circle who really doesn't feel part of America, very much a guest. So you get a different perspective. The next responsum we're up to is 93, page 210. And this is, take us back to Morocco now. Here he is, Rav Moshe Malka. Chief Rabbi at Petach Tikva. We had a number of questions of his earlier in the semester. He was rabbi based in Casablanca, comes to Eretz Yisrael in 1967, becomes a chief rabbi at Petach Tikva, has 6 volumes of Tshuvot Mikveh Hamayim, and 1 volume, I don't know why he changed the name, his last volume of responses is called Veheshiv Moshe. And this appears from Veheshiv Moshe. In the second, there's 2 volumes of Veheshiv Moshe. In the second, 2 volumes he published. One is Veheshiv Moshe, the other is his Drushos, but he also has notes on the Torah Tamima, if anyone's interested in Torah Tamima. So I asked him a few questions. This is 1991, where I was already working at Brandeis, and I'm giving classes. I would come once a week, and I'd give a shiur there. And he begins by saying, so the first question was, well, you'll see from the answer to the question, he says it's good that you're Mazakes Harabim, but Fatzes Torah being a studentin, that you're teaching Torah to the students. My question was as follows. We know that there's a principle of mutav shogin. That is, if you know people are not going to listen to a certain halachot, you're not supposed to say it publicly. You're not supposed to do it because it's better that they don't know it than that they know it and violate it. And some rabbis have written about if the rabbi learned Shabbos morning that the Eruv is down and all the women have pushed their baby carriages and all sorts of things, don't announce the Eruv is down because there's no way really to solve this problem. They're not going to listen, and it's better that they don't know. When this applies, this principle of mutav shogin applies in many cases. One of my claims, incidentally, is that the reason we've seen the various chumras in the last generation, there's a lot written about it, even Rupture and Reconstruction, Chaim Soloveitchik wrote about it. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the people, when you look at Moshe Feinstein, for instance, he's deciding for people of different backgrounds. Even Avad Yosef, you'll see.
And Christopher Rufo, the guy who got Trump to ban racial training, anti-white racism in federal government and with contractors. He tweets, in the past week, Twitter censors a sitting president, YouTube blocks election-related videos, Eventbrite cancels Trump events, GoFundMe deletes data researchers, Facebook bans protest groups. They're deliberately disenfranchising conservatives from the public square, and now Rich Barris, the people's pundit, he's been banned on
expressions
Twitter.
Like better that they be unwitting sinners, better that they we can rely on this kula because it's too hard otherwise, that they might not listen to us. You have all these expressions. We can't we can't establish halacha the way we'd like to, so we have to go with leniencies. But if you're Revel Yashiv or you're in Bnei Brak and you're possibly for a completely yeshivish environment, those principles never come into play. That all the posting throughout history have used. What are you, Mutav Shogin? They're going to listen to whatever you tell them. So you never have this idea that, well, we won't tell them this. We're relying on a lenient opinion because.
Okay, Steve Saylor writes today, the new normal by any means necessary. Huge question is whether the shameful and shameless tactics deployed by the establishment against Donald Trump in 2020, such as censoring online media, editorializing the news, covering up massive law-breaking, blacklisting, threats of additional riots if Joe Biden is not elected, and much more, will be dropped going forward as only having been justified by the once-in-a-lifetime ends justify the means necessity to dump Trump, or will by any means necessary become the new normal. Will Democrats and their media enablers apologize for their 2020 extremism and promise not to do it again? Or more likely, will the tenuous success of their anti-American norm breaking make them feel justified in amping up their bad behavior post-Trump on the grounds that they must do whatever it takes to head off the possibility of another Trump ever again arising? Consider another example that emerged only this week, how the public announcement of the blockbuster result of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine test was delayed until after Election Day. The best coronavirus strategy that any president could come up with has always been to be president when vaccines start rolling out. Thus, Trump long claimed that a vaccine would succeed real soon now, while Democrats downplayed that idea and spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about vaccines. Back on November 1, the New York Times news section gloated, "Welcome to November. For Trump, the October surprise never came." Trump's hope that an economic recovery, a COVID vaccine, or a Biden scandal could shake up the race faded with the last light of October. President Trump began the fall campaign rooting for and trying to orchestrate a last-minute surprise that would vault him ahead of Joe Biden, a coronavirus vaccine, ... I'm not easily shockable, writes Saylor, but I found it eyebrow-raising to discover that the November surprise, Monday's announcement of the Pfizer team that their new vaccine was spectacularly effective, over 90%, likely could have been made a week earlier, which would have given Trump a late October surprise. The success of the Pfizer vaccine in a clinical trial serves as a proof of concept that some other vaccines, several with less awkward cold storage requirements than Pfizer's, might also work. It's very good news. As it turned out, Joe Biden's team was notified of the success of the Pfizer vaccine on Sunday, 5 days after the election, while the White House heard about it on Monday, along with the rest of the world. Pfizer chose in October to deviate substantially from its published clinical protocol for conducting the vaccine trial. It's remarkable. So, in other words, the company skipped both the first and second cases scheduled interim analyses, only did the third just so that they could delay the results. The firms had their labs essentially stop processing cases and just put the samples in cold storage. They stopped the count. They ran out the election count. They didn't choose a sample size for when to report. They chose a date. So it appears that Monday's announcement could have been made before the election, but the corporations weren't in the mood to follow their own protocol, and Trump's FDA let them get away with stalling on telling voters and investors what had been achieved. From a political and financial standpoint, the firms likely made the self-interested right decision to delay. Even giant pharmaceutical companies don't want to wind up on blacklists for vengeance by Democrats. But from a scientific and ethical perspective, it was highly questionable. Will Trump's Securities and Exchange Commission inquire into why Pfizer did not follow its published protocol, or alert investors to its decision not to obey its announced plans? Keep in mind that a lot of people made decisions during the days when the firms had put the evidence on ice, literally, what stocks to buy, for whom to vote, when to schedule a wedding or a family reunion, without benefit of this useful information. The news media is constantly accusing Trump of authoritarianism, but for a notorious authoritarian, Trump sure does get pushed around and stabbed in the back a lot, even by his own hirelings. Trump has been a decent counterpuncher, but he's a poor conspirator. He's seldom been cynical enough about how low his foes would go against him. He doesn't have the attention span to obsess enough over what his enemies are planning to do to him in the future, so he's not often paranoid enough ahead of time about what his foes are up to. He's just not cynical enough, expecting people to like him rather than to try to do him down. Unfortunately, in our new normal, where the ends are felt to justify the means, the time for Trumpian optimism and naivete appears to be fading. A little more here from Marc Shapiro.
They'll do whatever you tell them. So therefore, you can strive for greater levels of stringency because whatever you tell them, they'll listen to. That's very different than a posek like Ramosha, because what do you mean? He could say things, you're not going to listen to it because they're balabatim, and balabatim don't listen to everything. So you need to know what you can say and what you can't say. Every posek until the modern time.
So a posek is a decider of Jewish law, and balabatim means the common people.
Deals with this issue. There's this dialectic between what you can say and what the people will accept. It's only in the modern day when you have Haredi communities. You never before had Haredi communities. Such a concept never existed. We say in Rosh Hashanah, right? Yom Kippur, we ask permission to pray with sinners. But seriously, you never had this idea of a Haredi community. The closest you ever had was in a yeshiva. They were davening together Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but you never had a community of just yeshivish types who were completely pious in all these areas. You always had communities which had all sorts of people. And therefore, and I'm talking every single century, look in the Rambam, the issues he had to deal with. And of course, look in the Gemara as well. So this is, people don't realize this is a completely new phenomenon. Either l'shvach or l'ganai. It's your own opinions. Some people don't think it's so good because communities are supposed to have all types. Others think it's great because now we can finally reach levels of halakhic observance that we never had before. But so the question is, though, what am I supposed to do when I'm teaching? Because I saw that Rav Yosef Nassas says that when you teach, you have to teach everything. You don't skip when you're teaching. When you give, let's say, an announcement, or let's say you give a drasha or something, then you don't tell people something that you don't think they're going to listen to. You just tell like maybe a few people. But Rav Yosef Nassas says that when you actually are, let's say, you're going siman after siman, that you don't skip. If the people don't, because look, that you have to teach the halacha. If they don't want to listen, they're not going to listen. That's different than getting up and making an announcement. And he says as follows. He says you should go according to the Seder and Shulchan Aruch. Don't skip any halachot unless you see that it's not today. It's not relevant. For example, Siman Gimel in Orach Chaim Shulchan Aruch, there's some things dealing with going to the bathroom. Today we have modern bathrooms, so it's irrelevant. Or he says Siman Lamed Beis, which deal with how to write tefillin. That's not something you need to. If you're sitting and you're studying going through Shulchan Aruch, that's for specialists. You don't need to teach the average.
Okay, that's going to do it for today. Take care, everyone. Good night, and God bless.